Imagine you were handed a map, not a map of streets or countries, a map of time, a map showing where everything began, where writing was invented, where laws were first written down, where cities were first built, where human beings first looked at each other and said, "We are a civilization." You've seen this map. You've been taught this map. It probably starts somewhere in the Middle East, in a region between two rivers. It shows a chain of empires moving westward, toward Greece, toward Rome, toward Europe, toward the modern world. It is clean. It is logical. It moves in one direction. It feels like progress. Here's the problem. That map was drawn by people with reasons to draw it a certain way. Not a conspiracy. Not a secret buried in a vault. Something far more human and far more dangerous than that. It was drawn by conquerors who needed to see themselves as the heirs of greatness, by scholars who only looked where the money told them to look, by colonial administrators who needed history to justify what they were doing to living people, and by all of us every time we repeated the story without asking a single question. The real map of civilization's origins is older, stranger, more global, and far more beautiful than anything you were taught. And once you see it, the version they gave you will never look the same again. Let's start with what most of us think we know. Somewhere around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, in a flat, fertile region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq, something extraordinary happened. People who had been living in villages and farming settlements for generations suddenly began to do something no human beings had done before. They built cities, real cities, with streets, with granaries, with temples that touched the sky and markets that hummed with trade. They invented writing. They created law. They organized armies. They built the first recognizable states. We call this civilization. We call this people the Sumerians. And for most of recorded scholarship, this moment, this place, has been treated as the starting line, the beginning of the race that ends in the world we live in today. The story is compelling. It is also incomplete in ways that change everything. But before we get to what is missing, let's understand why this version became the dominant one. Because the story of how we decided civilization began is itself a story about power and archaeology and the assumptions buried inside every question a scholar asks. In the early 19th century, the Middle East was being torn open by European archaeologists, many of them operating under the patronage of colonial governments or wealthy private sponsors. They were digging in places the Bible mentioned. They were looking for a confirmation of stories they already believed. When they found the ruins of Nineveh and Babylon, and then eventually the deeper, older layer beneath them, the ruins of Sumer, they found something that fit perfectly into a framework they had already constructed. Here were cities. Here was writing. Here was evidence of organized religion, centralized power, and agricultural abundance. Here, in other words, was the origin of everything familiar. The framework was almost entirely Eurocentric and, by the standards of modern scholarship, remarkably narrow. Progress flowed from the ancient Near East to Greece, from Greece to Rome, from Rome to medieval Europe, from Europe to the modern world. This was not just a historical argument. It was a moral one. It implied that civilization was a particular kind of thing, urban, literate, hierarchical, and ultimately Western in its final destination. Everything outside that line, the cities of sub-Saharan Africa, the sophisticated societies of pre-Columbian America, the ancient networks of South and Southeast Asia, was treated as peripheral, derivative, or simply invisible. But the cracks in this story had already begun to appear. And some of those cracks went very, very deep. Here's the first crack. The word civilization itself is loaded in ways most people never stop to examine. It comes from the Latin word civitas, meaning city, which means, embedded in the very definition we use, is the assumption that city life is a standard by which all human organization must be measured. A society without cities is, by definition, not quite civilized. A people who chose to live in smaller, more dispersed communities, no matter how complex their social structure, their spiritual life, their agricultural knowledge, or their artistic expression, fall below the threshold. This definition was not neutral. It was designed implicitly to rank human societies, and the societies that ranked highest happened to be the ones closest to the people doing the ranking. Now, To be fair to the scholars of the early 20th century, the work they did was genuinely remarkable. The decipherment of cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of ancient Sumer, was one of the great intellectual achievements in the history of human inquiry. The picture that emerged from those clay tablets was astonishing. Here were records of grain prices and land contracts, and legal disputes and love poems and creation myths that would echo through every subsequent civilization in the Western world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written down by Sumerian scribes, told the story of a great flood more than 1,000 years before the book of Genesis was composed. Sumer was real. The civilizational achievement of Mesopotamia was genuine. None of that was a lie. But what was left out of the story was enormous. And some of it was left out deliberately, and some of it was left out because nobody thought to look, and some of it was left out because what was found did not fit the story that needed to be told. Let's talk about fitting the story. In 1856, railway workers in the Punjab region of what was then colonial British India came across some ancient fire-baked bricks. The bricks were unusual, dense, carefully made, clearly very old. The railway engineers used them as ballast under their tracks, unknowingly destroying an ancient site, and moved on. It would be another 60 years before anyone realized that those bricks were remnants of a civilization that rivaled ancient Sumer in size, sophistication, and antiquity. We'll come back to that civilization later. It changes everything. Or consider this. In the 1890s, British archaeologists working in Egypt uncovered evidence of extensive contact between ancient Egyptians and the people of sub-Saharan Africa. Evidence that strongly suggested the Egyptian civilization did not emerge in isolation, but was shaped by cultural exchanges reaching deep into the African interior. That evidence was cataloged, filed, and largely ignored for the next 100 years. It did not fit the map. The map had already been drawn, and anything that challenged it was either dismissed or explained away. This is not a recent insight. Scholars have been pointing out for decades, but it has been slow to penetrate the popular version of the story. The version taught in schools, repeated in documentaries, reinforced in museums. The version that most of us carry around in our heads without ever questioning it. So let's question it. The standard story of civilization tells us that human beings lived as hunter-gatherers for most of their history, organized in small, nomadic bands, and then, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. They discovered farming. And farming changed everything. It allowed population growth, which created surplus, which required storage, which demanded organization, which led to hierarchy, which built cities, which produced writing, which gave us civilization. This is called the Neolithic Revolution, and it is taught as one of the pivotal transitions in human history. The moment we stopped wandering and started building. And again, much of this is true. Farming was transformative. It did enable population growth. It did lead to cities and writing and everything that followed. But here's the question nobody seemed to ask until relatively recently. What if farming did not cause civilization? What if the relationship was more complicated, or even reversed? What if human beings were capable of extraordinary social and architectural complexity before they invented agriculture? What if the impulse that built civilization was not economic? Not about surplus and storage, but something far older and far stranger. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was surveying a hillside in southeastern Turkey when he noticed something unusual about the shape of the ground. He began to excavate. What he found would force a complete rewrite of the timeline. It would not be buried there silently for much longer. Let's put a pin in Göbekli Tepe. We'll return to it in full in the next chapter, because it deserves everything we can give it. But before we leave this chapter, let's address something that the standard map gets wrong in a way that feels almost personal. The standard map is not just geographically narrow. It is temporally shallow. What it implies, and what most people absorb without realizing it, is that human beings were not really doing much for the 95% of our existence as a species that preceded the last 5 to 10,000 years. That we were waiting, essentially, biologically ready for civilization, but not yet awakened to it. That something external, farming or climate change or population pressure, flipped a switch that had been sitting in the off position for 200,000 years. This picture is almost certainly wrong, and it is wrong in a way that tells us something important about who we are. Modern archaeology and genetics have made it unmistakably clear that the humans who lived 30,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, were not intellectually inferior to us. Their brains were the same size. Their capacity for language, for abstract thought, for social complexity, was identical to ours. They painted extraordinary scenes on cave walls. They navigated open oceans. They built long-distance trade networks that spanned continents. They conducted elaborate burial rituals that imply sophisticated beliefs about death and the afterlife. They were us. Fully, completely, intellectually us. So, why does the story of civilization begin so recently? Part of the answer is practical. Organic materials decay. Wood rots, cloth disintegrates. The body returns to the earth. What survives, what we can dig up, tend to be stone, bone, and fire clay. This biases our picture of the past toward cultures that built in stone, that used ceramics, that left a hard record. Many of the most complex ancient societies may have left no physical trace we can find. But part of the answer is not practical at all. It is a choice about where to look, what to count, and whose story to consider worth telling. And that choice, made by European scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries, shape a narrative we are still trying to escape. Here is what this chapter is really about. It is not about discrediting Sumer or ancient Mesopotamia. Those civilizations were extraordinary, and their contributions to human history are beyond question. Writing, codified law, complex urban planning, astronomical observation. The list is real and it is long. What this chapter is about is the frame, the lens, the decision about where the story begins and whose story it is. Because when you start with the assumption that civilization has a single point of origin, a single river valley, a single ethnic group, a single cultural trajectory, you are not describing history. You are narrating myth. You are telling a story about a chosen people who started something that the rest of the world eventually received. And that myth has consequences. It has consequences in how we teach children, in how museums are organized, in which ancient ruins get funding and which get looted, in which modern nations see themselves as heirs to civilization, and which are made to feel like latecomers. The actual history is not one sunrise. It is many, scattered across every continent except Antarctica, happening at different times, for different reasons, with different outcomes. Sometimes borrowing from each other across vast distances, sometimes developing in complete isolation, always changing, always collapsing and rebuilding, never finished. And the first chapter of that real story begins not in a river valley between two rivers, but on a cold hilltop in Turkey 12,000 years ago, before farming, before pottery, before any of the things we associate with civilization, before the map we were given even begins. Somebody was already building. Picture a hillside in southeastern Turkey. The year is 1963. A team of archaeologists from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University is conducting a survey of the region, cataloging ancient sites, mapping the landscape, doing the methodical, unglamorous work that archaeology mostly is. They arrive at a place called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, that name means Potbelly Hill, and from a distance, it looks like exactly what it sounds like. A rounded, unremarkable mound rising above a flat and dusty plain, about 15 kilometers northeast of the city of Sanliurfa. They look at it. They take some notes. They find some flint flakes on the surface and conclude the site is probably medieval. Nothing important here. They move on. That assessment would stand for 31 years. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at the same hill. Schmidt had been reading the Chicago survey notes, and something about the flint fragments nagged at him. They did not look medieval. They looked far, far older. He drove out to Potbelly Hill, climbed it, picked up a few pieces of worked stone from the surface, and understood immediately that whoever had been here before had made a catastrophic error. This was not medieval. This was not even close to medieval. Schmidt began to excavate, and as the first layer of soil came away, something emerged from the ground that should not have been there. Not by any timeline anyone had constructed. Not by any theory of human development that had been agreed upon in a century of serious archaeology. It was a carved stone pillar, perfectly shaped, massive, covered in relief sculptures of animals, foxes and scorpions and vultures, rendered with a skill and intentionality that left no room for misunderstanding. Schmidt and his team kept digging. They found more pillars, then more enclosures, then evidence of structures so large and so carefully planned that the word monumental was not an exaggeration. When they dated what they had found, the results came back in a range that none of them were fully prepared to absorb. Göbekli Tepe was approximately 11,600 years old. Let that number breathe for a moment. 11,600 years old. Stonehenge, the great stone monument on the Salisbury Plain in England that most people associate with ancient mystery and ancient ambition, was built roughly 5,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 4,500 years ago. Göbekli Tepe predates the pyramids by more than 7,000 years. At the time Göbekli Tepe was being constructed, there was no writing anywhere on Earth. There was no pottery. There was no agriculture. There were no domesticated animals, except possibly the dog. The human beings who built it were hunter-gatherers. They lived by following herds and harvesting wild plants. They had no cities, no permanent villages, no concept of surplus storage or long-distance trade in the sense we associate with later civilizations. And yet, they moved stones weighing between 10 and 20 tons up a hillside. They carved detailed, accurate animal reliefs using tools that were nothing more than sharpened flint. They organized a workforce, necessarily a large one, across what must have been a wide geographical area, because no single band of hunter-gatherers could have supplied enough labor to build what was built here. They came together, fed themselves, coordinated their work, and built something that would outlast every empire the ancient Near East would ever produce. The question is not just what they built. The question is why. And the answer to that question dismantles the timeline of human civilization more completely than almost any other discovery in the history of archaeology. To understand what Göbekli Tepe tells us, you need to understand what the Standard Model said about the relationship between religion, civilization, and agriculture. The Standard Model, stated simply, went like this. First, humans discovered farming. Farming created surplus food. Surplus food allowed populations to grow and concentrate in one place. Concentrated populations required organization, which led to hierarchy and governance. And once you had hierarchy and governance, you had the conditions for everything else, including religion as an organized, institutionalized force. Temples, priests, ritual specialists, these were luxuries of stable, agricultural societies. You needed to be fed before you could afford to think about the gods. In other words, material conditions produce spiritual ones. Food first, faith second. Göbekli Tepe says the opposite may be true. Because here is what Klaus Schmidt found when he looked carefully at the site. There were no grinding stones, no storage bins, no hearths for cooking, no evidence of permanent habitation, no bones of domesticated animals, no carbonized seeds from agricultural plants. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement. It was not a village. It was not the remains of community that happened to build something impressive on the way to work each morning. It was a sanctuary. A ritual site, a place people came to, not a place people lived. Schmidt spent the rest of his life working on this site, until his death in 2014, and his reading of what it meant was, by the time he died, widely shared among his colleagues. He believed Göbekli Tepe was evidence that organized religion, or something we would recognize as religion, preceded agriculture. That the impulse to build a sacred space, to gather in pursuit of something beyond daily survival, came before the invention of farming, not after. And here's the part that makes it even more extraordinary. There's wild einkorn wheat growing on the hillsides around Göbekli Tepe. Einkorn is one of the oldest domesticated grains in the world. Genetic analysis of modern domesticated einkorn traces its ancestry to wild plants from precisely this region of southeastern Turkey. The domestication of wheat appears to have happened right here, in the shadow of this monument. Schmidt proposed, and other researchers have built on this, that the causation may have run in the opposite direction from what the Standard Model assumed, that the need to feed the people gathered to build and maintain Göbekli Tepe may have driven the invention of agriculture. that farming did not produce the conditions for ritual life. Ritual life may have produced conditions for farming. Faith first, food second, if that reading is correct, and it remains debated. As good ideas always are, then the entire foundation of the story of civilization has to be rewritten. Let's talk about the pillars. The site currently has multiple enclosures that have been excavated, and ground-penetrating radar surveys suggest there are at least 16 more buried structures still underground. Only about 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. The rest waits in the dark. What has been uncovered is staggering enough. The most elaborate enclosures contain pairs of large central T-shaped pillars, surrounded by a ring of smaller pillars set into low stone walls. The T-shape is distinctive. These are not rough-hewn rocks propped upright in the earth. They are precisely carved limestone monoliths, shaped to a consistent form that clearly meant something to the people who made them. In several cases, the arms and hands of human figures have been carved in low relief along the sides of the pillars, as if the T-shape itself represents a being, a figure standing with arms pressed to its sides. Are they gods? Ancestors? Supernatural guardians? We do not know. We cannot know for certain, because the people who built them left no written record. They had no writing. They could not tell us what they believed. We are left to read the stones themselves. And the stones speak in a language of animals. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe are dominated by creatures. Foxes appear more than any other animal, repeated, detailed, sometimes depicted in long processions across the face of a pillar. Scorpions, vultures with outstretched wings, snakes coiling upward, wild boar, cranes, lions, ducks in flight. These are not random decorations. The repetition is too consistent, the placement too deliberate. These animals clearly meant something specific, were associated with specific beliefs, specific stories, specific powers that the builders wanted to invoke or commemorate or contain. Some researchers have proposed that the site was connected to beliefs about death and the afterlife. Vultures and scorpions appear repeatedly, and both are animals associated with the dead across many ancient cultures. Vultures because they consume corpses, scorpions because they live in the earth. A particular relief carving showing a headless human figure with an erection surrounded by vultures has been interpreted as a depiction of death ritual, specifically the practice of excarnation, in which bodies were exposed to birds to be stripped of flesh before the bones were collected for burial. This is speculative, but it is not unreasonable, and it points towards something important. The people who built Göbekli Tepe had a rich, complex, symbolic inner life. They had beliefs about death and what came after it. They had a vocabulary of images that communicated those beliefs across a large community. They had, in other words, a culture, a deep culture, a culture sophisticated enough to mobilize enormous collective labor in service of ideas rather than material necessity. That is not the behavior of people waiting to be civilized. That is civilization, or something so close to it that the distinction becomes a question of definition rather than substance. Now here is the detail that nobody in the standard account wants to sit with for very long. Around 8000 BCE, roughly 3,600 years after it was first built, Göbekli Tepe was buried, deliberately, intentionally filled in with sediment, flint, broken animal bones, and rubble. The enclosures were covered over one by one until the entire site was a featureless mound. Who buried it? The people who had been using it, presumably the descendants of the builders, or the communities that inherited the traditions that had made it sacred. But why? No one knows. This is one of the great open mysteries of prehistoric archaeology. Was it a ritual closing, a ceremonial end to the site's sacred function, preserved for future by being interred rather than abandoned? Was it an act of concealment, hiding the site from enemies or from a changing religious climate? Was it an act of grief, burying a place that had lost its meaning as the people who gave it meaning dispersed or disappeared? The burial is, in its own way, as remarkable as construction. It required sustained, organized effort. It was not an accident. Somebody decided that this place should go into the earth, and so it did. And there it remained undisturbed, preserved almost perfectly for 11,000 years, until Klaus Schmidt climbed a hill in southeastern Turkey and decided not to take someone else's word for it. What Göbekli Tepe does to the story of civilization can be summarized in one sentence. It proves that the capacity for complex organized behavior, including monument building, long-range coordination, sophisticated symbolic thought, and possibly the roots of agriculture itself, existed in human beings thousands of years before any of the things we usually point to as the conditions for that behavior. It proves that the standard model had the causation backwards, or at least partially backwards. That human beings were not passive recipients of the civilizational spark that came from outside them, from the invention of farming, or the appearance of surplus, or the pressure of population growth. They were the source of the spark. Their inner lives, their beliefs, their hunger for meaning, their desire to build something that would outlast them, drove the material transformations we call civilization, not the other way around. This has implications that ripple outward in every direction. It means that other ancient sites we have dismissed as simple or primitive may be far more complex than we assumed. It means the timeline of human cognitive and social development needs to be pushed back much further than we were comfortable with. It means that somewhere beneath the surface of the earth, in places we have not yet thought to look, there are almost certainly other Göbekli Tepes waiting. And it means that the story of where civilization came from is not a story about a particular place or particular people. It is a story about what human beings fundamentally are. We are builders. We have always been builders. Not because we had to be, because something in us insists on it. But even knowing this, even accepting that the hunger for meaning and the capacity for organized collective life are far older than the textbooks say, we still have to account for what happened next, for the moment when cities genuinely did appear, when writing genuinely was invented, when the institutions we recognize as civilization took a form we can trace directly into our own world. That moment did happen, in a specific place, among specific people. And the story of that moment, the real story, not the sanitized version, is more complicated, more violent, more surprising, and more human than any textbook has ever been willing to tell you. The Sumerians built something extraordinary, but they were also building on foundations that were already ancient, and what they left out of their own story tells us as much as what they left in. Sometime around 3200 BCE, a person sat down with small reed stylus and pressed its wedge-shaped tip into a damp clay tablet. What they wrote was not a poem. It was not a prayer. It was not a declaration of war or a king's proclamation of glory. It was a list of beer rations, quantities of grain allocated to different workers. Accounting, the first written document in human history, was essentially a receipt. Think about what that means. For all the romance we attach to the invention of writing, the idea of a great civilization reaching for permanence, for memory, for the ability to speak across time, the first thing a human being chose to commit to durable record was a spreadsheet, not the name of a god, not the story of creation, not a love letter or a lamentation or a philosophical meditation on the nature of existence. Beer rations. This is not a diminishment of the achievement. It is, if anything, a clarification of it. Because what it tells us is that writing was not born from the desire for art or religion or philosophy. It was born from the need to manage complexity, to track who owed what to whom, to impose order on an economy that had grown too large for any single human memory to contain. Civilization, in other words, began with bureaucracy. And that single fact tells you more about what civilization actually is than almost anything else you will hear today. Let's go back to the beginning of what we know. Sumer was a collection of city-states in a flat, fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the region the ancient Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers. The major cities, Uruk, Uar, Lagash, Nippur, Eridu, were not villages or large towns. They were, by any reasonable definition, cities. Uruk at its height, around 3000 BC, may have housed somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 people inside its walls. For a time, it was almost certainly the largest human settlement on Earth. Let that sink in. 50,000 people, living in one place, dependent on each other for food, for water, for protection, for the resolution of disputes, for the maintenance of an elaborate infrastructure of canals and granaries and temples and walls. Managing this required institutions. It required laws. It required a professional class of administrators and priests and soldiers whose entire purpose was to keep the system running. And to keep the system running, you needed to write things down. The writing system the Sumerians developed, cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge, began as a set of pictograms. A picture of a head meant head. A picture of grain meant grain. A picture of a fish meant fish. Simple enough. But over time, these pictograms were abstracted, reduced to combinations of wedge-shaped impressions that bore no visual resemblance to the things they represented. The script became phonetic. It could record not just objects, but sounds. Not just nouns, but verbs, adjectives, prepositions. Not just quantities, but ideas. By around 2600 BCE, someone was using the system to write literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a great king of Uruk who sought immortality and found instead the lesson that every human being eventually has to learn, is the oldest surviving work of narrative literature in human history. It predates Homer by more than 1,500 years. It contains a flood narrative that parallels the story of Noah in striking detail. When European scholars first read the Gilgamesh tablets in the 1870s, the discovery sent shockwaves through the intellectual world. Not just because of the flood story, though that generated enormous controversy in religious circles, but because the sheer literary sophistication of the text made it impossible to maintain the comfortable assumption that everything of real cultural value had originated in the classical Mediterranean world. Here was a story of grief and friendship and the terror of death, written in a language nobody had spoken for 2,000 years, from a civilization that had been buried under a desert for millennia. And it was magnificent. This was real. This was a genuine achievement of Mesopotamian civilization, and it deserved every bit of the admiration it received. But the admiration had a cost. It narrowed the lens. It focused attention so intensely on what Sumer had done that it obscured what Sumer had not done, what Sumer had inherited, and what Sumer had actively erased. Let's start with what Sumer inherited. The assumption in most popular accounts of Mesopotamian civilization is that the Sumerians were, in some meaningful sense, originators, that they built their cities in a kind of cultural vacuum, developing their institutions from the ground up, the way a person invents something alone in a room. This is not what archaeology suggests. The Ubaid culture, a society that preceded the Sumerians in the same region, had already developed sophisticated agriculture, canal irrigation, large-scale mud brick architecture, and long-distance trade networks that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. The Ubaid period lasted from roughly 6,500 to 3,700 BCE. When the Sumerians emerged as a distinct cultural and linguistic group, they were not building on an empty plain. They were inheriting a landscape already shaped by thousands of years of accumulated human effort. The question of where the Sumerians themselves came from is, frankly, still open. Their language is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no known relatives among any other language family on Earth. This has generated endless speculation. That they came from somewhere else, that they displaced an earlier population, that the civilization of Sumer was in some sense a transplant. None of these theories are settled. What is settled is that the Sumerians did not create civilization from nothing. They built on foundations already ancient. And the trade networks that fed those foundations connected Mesopotamia to a world far wider than most people imagine. By 3000 BC, Sumer was not an isolated miracle. It was a node in a web. There is abundant archaeological evidence of trade between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley civilization, more than 2,000 kilometers to the east. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue, semi-precious stone mined in Afghanistan, appears in Sumerian royal tombs and temples in enormous quantities. Getting it to Sumer required someone to mine it, someone to carry across mountain passes and river valleys and open desert, and someone to sell it to merchants waiting at the docks of Ur or Uruk. This was not casual exchange. This was organized, sustained, long-distance trade involving multiple cultures, multiple languages, and multiple sets of rules about how commerce worked. Copper from Oman, carnelian beads from India, cedar wood from Lebanon, gold from Egypt. The markets of Uruk were not fed by local resources alone. They were fed by a network so extensive that collapsing any one part of it caused ripple effects felt thousands of kilometers away. This matters because it means that the civilizational development of Sumer cannot be separated from the civilizational development of the cultures it traded with. They were not independent variables in some grand historical experiment. They were entangled from the beginning. When Sumer grew, it grew in part because of what was pulling in from everywhere else. When it stagnated or declined, the network felt it. And when the network wobbled, as it would catastrophically in the late second millennium BC, Sumer felt that too. The standard story presents Mesopotamian civilization as a kind of gift to the world, as though the Sumerians invented the essentials and then handed them outward, and the rest of humanity gratefully received them. The actual history was a conversation, a long, complex, sometimes violent, always changing conversation between dozens of cultures across an enormous geography. Sumer spoke loudly in that conversation, but it was not the only voice. Now let's talk about what Sumer left out of its own story. Because the Sumerians had writing, we have their version of events. And their version of events, like every version of events produced by a civilization with something to protect, had some significant gaps. The most important gap was women. In the earliest Sumerian records, from the Proto-Literate period before 3000 BC, there is evidence of women in roles that would later disappear almost entirely. Women served as scribes. Women held administrative positions. Women ran certain categories of trade. The priestess class, particularly the high priestesses associated with the goddess Inanna, held enormous political and economic power. The role of En, or high priest or high priestess of a major temple, was one of the most powerful positions in Sumerian society. And for significant periods of early Sumerian history, that role was held by women. Enheduanna, daughter of the empire builder Sargon of Akkad, who conquered and unified the Sumerian city-states around 2300 BC, is the first named author in human history. A woman, a priestess, a political figure of enormous influence who composed hymns to Inanna that are still read today, nearly 4,300 years after she wrote them. When she was removed from her position by a political rival, she wrote a poem of such raw grief and fury that modern readers recognize the emotion immediately. She is not a distant figure. She is a human being in distress, using language the way human beings in distress have always used it, to insist that someone, somewhere, bears witness. But Enheduanna is an exception in the record precisely because the record changed. After the Akkadian conquest and the political reorganizations that followed it, women's roles in Mesopotamian public life contracted sharply. The great goddess Inanna, later known as Ishtar, retained her importance in the religious imagination, but the earthly power of her priestesses diminished. The law codes that followed, culminating in the famous Code of Hammurabi, written around 1750 BC, placed women firmly and explicitly under the legal authority of fathers and husbands. The world that had, at its origins, made room for female leadership had closed that room and sealed the door. This was not a historical accident. It was a choice, a political reorganization with consequences that rippled forward for thousands of years. The world we inherited, with its embedded assumptions about gender and authority and who gets to hold power, has roots in decisions made in Mesopotamia in the second millennium BCE. And because those decisions were made by the people with the power to write things down, the earlier arrangement, the one with more room in it, was mostly written out of story. There is something else the standard account tend to gloss over when it talks about Sumer. The cities were not pleasant places to live, not for most people. The picture we often carry of ancient Mesopotamia is one of cultural flowering, poetry and mathematics and astronomy and law. And those things were real, but they rested on a foundation of relentless, grinding labor performed by people who had very little choice about whether or how they performed it. The Sumerian temple economy, the system by which the great ziggurats function as economic as well as religious centers, was essentially a redistributive system in which enormous amounts of agricultural labor were organized, managed, and taxed by the priestly class. Workers received rations of grain, oil, and wool. They lived in conditions we would recognize as severe poverty by any modern standard. And when the system demanded more canals dug, more granaries filled, more temples built, more walls raised against the next round of warfare between city-states, the demands were not negotiable. The Epic of Gilgamesh opens with a description of the Great Walls of Uruk. The narrator invites you to admire them, to walk their length, to understand that they represent the permanent achievement of a civilization worth celebrating. But embedded in the text, easily missed if you are not looking for it, is a passage in which the people of Uruk complain bitterly about Gilgamesh's treatment of them. He works them too hard. He takes their son for his armies and their daughters for his palace. He is a great king and an oppressive one, and the gods themselves have to intervene to give him a companion who will redirect his energy away from his people. The greatest literary work of the ancient world begins with a labor complaint, with ordinary people saying, in effect, "This system is crushing us." That tension between the extraordinary achievements of complex civilization and the suffering of the ordinary people who built it is present at the very beginning of the written record. It has never gone away. It is woven into the fabric of what civilization is. The Sumerians built something remarkable, and they built it on the backs of people who did not get to write the story of what it cost. And then there is a question of what happened to Sumer, because Sumer did not last. The great cities decayed. The canal systems silted up and were abandoned. Uruk, which had once housed tens of thousands of people, shrank to a fraction of its size. The Akkadian Empire rose and fell. The third dynasty of Ur rose and fell. By the early second millennium BCE, the center of gravity in Mesopotamia had shifted northward to Babylon and Assyria, and the Sumerian language was no longer spoken as a living tongue. It survived only as a sacred language, used in temples and schools the way Latin was used in medieval European churches, a language of authority and tradition that nobody grew up speaking. What killed Sumer? The honest answer is many things. Warfare between city-states depleted populations and destroyed infrastructure. The canal systems that made large-scale agriculture possible required constant maintenance, and when that maintenance failed, when political instability interrupted the organized labor needed to keep the channels clear, the land salinized. Salt accumulated in the soil from centuries of irrigation, reducing crop yields in a slow, grinding agricultural crisis that probably contributed more to the decline of Sumerian cities than any single military defeat. This is a pattern, not just in Mesopotamia, not just in antiquity, a pattern that recurs throughout the history of complex civilization with an almost brutal regularity. The very mechanisms that make a civilization great, its irrigation systems, its specialized labor, its complex trade networks, its centralized administration, are also the mechanisms that make it fragile. They require constant maintenance. They create dependencies. They reduce redundancy. When they fail fast. The Sumerians built something extraordinary, and then it fell. And the story of why it fell tells us things about our own civilization that we would probably prefer not to hear. But that story, the story of collapse and what it really means, that is a chapter we will get to. First, we need to go somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the standard map barely acknowledges. Somewhere that forces a question of whose civilization counts and whose gets buried under silence. In the late 3rd millennium BCE, the same period when Ur was reaching its greatest power in Mesopotamia, there were cities in the Indus Valley that were larger, more carefully planned, and in some ways more sophisticated than anything the Sumerians had built. They had indoor plumbing. They had standardized weights and measures. They had a writing system that to this day has never been deciphered. We know almost nothing about who led them. We know almost nothing about their religion. We do not know what language they spoke, or what they believed about death, or what stories they told their children. What we know is that they existed, that they were enormous, that they were extraordinary, and that for most of modern history, they were treated as a footnote. That is not an accident. It is a choice. And it is a choice with a story behind it. A story about colonialism and archaeology, and the politics of deciding which civilizations deserve to be remembered. There is a city beneath a city beneath a city. In the province of Punjab, in what is now Pakistan, there is a place called Harappa. Today it is a small town, unremarkable from a distance, sitting on a bend of the old Ravi River in a flat agricultural plain. For most of its modern history, the people who lived nearby knew the ancient mounds that surrounded the town as a source of building material. The bricks were old, they were sturdy, and they were free. For decades, perhaps centuries, locals quarried them. In the 1850s, as we noted briefly before, railway engineers used them by the millions as ballast under the tracks of the Lahore-Multan line. Hundreds of thousands of tons of ancient fired brick, carry within them the silent record of a vanished world, crushed under iron rails so that colonial administrators could move goods and soldiers more efficiently across a subcontinent they were busy extracting. Nobody stopped to ask what they were destroying. Nobody thought to ask. And that lack of curiosity was not innocent. It was a product of a set of assumptions so deeply embedded in the colonial mind that they did not register as assumptions at all. They registered as facts. The fact that the people of the Indian subcontinent had not built anything worth preserving before the arrival of civilizing influences from outside. The fact that history, real history, was something that happened elsewhere and then arrived here. The fact that South Asia was a land of ancient superstition and timeless poverty, not a land of cities. When the first serious excavation of Harappa began in the 1920s under the direction of the Archaeological Survey of India, what emerged from the earth contradicted every one of those assumptions with force that should have been impossible to ignore. It was largely ignored anyway. The Indus Valley civilization, also called a Harappan civilization, after the first major site to be excavated, flourished from roughly 3000 to 1500 BC across a territory that dwarfs both ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt combined. Take a moment with that geography. At its peak, the Indus Valley civilization covered approximately 1 million square kilometers. It stretched from the highlands of Balochistan in the west to the plains of what is now the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh in the east, and from the foothills of the Himalayas in the north to the Gujarat coast in the south. More than 1,000 sites have been identified. The two largest cities, Harappa in the north and Mohenjo-daro, 700 kilometers to the south on the banks of the Indus River, each housed populations estimated between 40,000 and 80,000 people at their height. By comparison, the largest Sumerian cities held perhaps 50,000 at their peak. The city of Memphis in Old Kingdom Egypt held somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000. The Indus Valley was not a provincial neighbor to these great civilizations. In terms of geographical reach and urban population, it was the largest civilization on Earth. And yet ask most people today to name 3 ancient civilizations, and they will say Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Some will say Mesopotamia. Almost none will say the Indus Valley. Why? Let's start with what was actually there, because it is astonishing. Mohenjo-daro. The name means Mound of the Dead in the Sindhi language, though what the inhabitants called it we do not know, was a planned city, not in a casual sense of a place that grew organically over centuries and ended up with some organization. A planned city in the modern, deliberate sense. It had a grid layout, streets running at right angles to each other, aligned almost precisely with the cardinal directions. City blocks of consistent size. Buildings constructed according to a standardized system using bricks that followed a fixed ratio 1 to 2 to 4 across the entire civilization. The same proportions found at Harappa, at sites in Gujarat, at coastal trading posts on the Arabian Sea. This standardization was not accidental. It required either a central authority imposing uniform standards across a vast territory or a shared cultural tradition so deeply embedded that it operated without enforcement. We do not know which. We do not know enough to say. What we know is what the streets and buildings tell us. And what they tell us is that the people who built this city were solving problems that cities in Mesopotamia and Egypt had not yet fully grappled with. Every major building in Mohenjo-daro had access to a sophisticated drainage system. Wastewater from individual homes flowed through covered brick drains into larger municipal channels that ran under the main streets, eventually emptying outside the city. This was not primitive. This was engineered sanitation at a scale that would not be seen again in the Western world until the Roman Empire, more than 2,000 years later. The houses themselves were equipped with what are unmistakably bathrooms, not latrine pits in a corner, brick-lined bathing platforms, with drains connecting to the street system. Some homes had indoor wells. The concept that clean water should come in and dirty water should go out, and that these two flows should be kept strictly separate, was built into the physical infrastructure of the city as a fundamental design principle. There was also a structure at Mohenjo-daro that excavators called the Great Bath, a large watertight tank of fired brick coated with bitumen sealant, fed by a well and drained by a large corbel drain at one end. The care with which it was constructed strongly suggests ritual significance. This was probably not a municipal swimming pool, but a place of ceremonial bathing, possibly associated with purification practices that would survive in modified form into the religious traditions of the Indian subcontinent for thousands of years to come. There were granaries. There were assembly halls. There was a raised citadel area in each major city, separated from the lower residential districts by height and by walls, suggesting some form of distinction between administrative or religious functions and everyday civic life. And there were artifacts. Thousands upon thousands of small carved seals, made of steatite and fired to a hard finish, depicting animals, a hump bull, a rhinoceros, a tiger, a figure seated in what looks remarkably like a yogic posture surrounded by animals, along with a script that has never been read. That script is one of the great unsolved puzzles of human intellectual history. More than 4,000 inscriptions have been found across the Indus Valley sites, on seals, on pottery, on copper tablets, on a signboard of such large scale that it was clearly meant to be read from a distance. The signs are distinctive, elegant, and unmistakably systematic. There are somewhere between 400 and 600 individual characters, a number that suggests either a syllabic or a logographic writing system rather than a purely alphabetic one. Nobody has cracked it, not for lack of trying. Dozens of scholars over a century have proposed decipherments, some of them serious and methodical, most of them eventually abandoned. The fundamental problem is the absence of a bilingual text, something like the Rosetta Stone, which allowed scholars to decode Egyptian hieroglyphics by comparing it to Greek texts saying the same thing. There is no Rosetta Stone for the Indus script. There is no anchor. Every proposed reading is built on assumptions that cannot be independently verified. What this means in practice is devastating. We cannot read their words. We cannot hear their voices. We have their cities, their tools, their art, their seals, their drains and their baths and their standardized bricks, but we cannot access their minds directly. We do not know what they call themselves. We do not know the names of their leaders. If they had leaders in the way we understand that word, we do not know what stories they told, what gods they worshipped, what they believed happened to the dead. We know they existed. We know they built something extraordinary. And we know that they're almost entirely absent from the story we tell about the origins of civilization. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. The Indus Valley civilization was not rediscovered by accident in the 1920s. It was rediscovered in spite of the interpretive framework that governed colonial archaeology in British India. The dominant framework, shaped by both classical scholarship and biblical chronology, held that true civilization in South Asia had arrived from outside. The Vedic tradition, which forms the foundation of what would become Hinduism, was associated by European scholars with the arrival of the so-called Aryans, a term borrowed from the Sanskrit word for noble, who were imagined as light-skinned, chariot-driving invaders from Central Asia who had swept into the subcontinent sometime around 1500 BCE and supplanted or absorbed whatever was there before them. This was the Aryan invasion theory, and in the colonial context, it served a useful narrative function. It said that the greatness of Indian civilization, the Vedas, the philosophy, the sophisticated cosmological traditions, had come from outside, from people imagined as racially and culturally closer to Europeans. And by implication, what was there before, what the original population of the subcontinent had built, was a primitive substrate that the invaders had civilized. When Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were excavated and dated to roughly 2500 BC, centuries before the supposed Aryan invasion, the inconvenient implication was clear. Here was a sophisticated urban civilization that had nothing to do with the Aryans. It had built itself from within. It was, by every measurable criterion, an indigenous achievement of the South Asian subcontinent. This did not fit the framework. So the framework bent to accommodate it rather than breaking. The Indus Valley civilization was acknowledged. It could not be ignored. The physical evidence was too massive, but it was described as a civilization that had risen and then been replaced. A dead end. A civilization without descendants. Its connection to later South Asian cultural traditions was downplayed or denied. The Vedic tradition, with its chariot culture and its fire sacrifice and its hymns to sky gods, seemed so different from the urban, drainage-obsessed world of Mohenjo-Daro that scholars concluded there could be little meaningful continuity between them. And so the Indus Valley joined a growing list of ancient civilizations that were acknowledged in principle and erased in practice. They were given a museum cabinet and then politely excluded from the main story. But modern archaeology and genetics have complicated this picture enormously. In the last 20 years, ancient DNA analysis has transformed our understanding of population history across the entire Old World. And what the genetics are showing, and this is still a contested, developing field, so we should hold conclusions carefully, is that the relationship between the Indus Valley population, the Vedic tradition, and the modern population of South Asia is far more complex and far more continuous than the colonial model assumed. There almost certainly was migration into the subcontinent from the Central Asian steppe, carrying with it what will become the Indo-European language family and elements of the Vedic religious tradition. That much appears increasingly well supported. But that migration did not erase what was there. It blended with it. The population of modern South Asia carries a genetic signature of the ancient Indus Valley inhabitants in substantial proportions, far more than the old invasion model would predict. This means the people of the Indus Valley are not a lost civilization in the deepest sense. They have descendants, living descendants, hundreds of millions of them, distributed across South Asia and its global diaspora. The civilization did not disappear into a void. It transformed, it blended, it contributed its genes, and almost certainly much of its cultural DNA to the traditions that followed it. The yoga posture on the Indus seal, the cross-legged figure surrounded by animals, may or may not be an ancestor of the yoga traditions that would develop within Hinduism. We cannot say with certainty. But the physical continuity of the population suggests that cultural continuity is far more likely than earlier scholarship was willing to admit. The ghost civilization was never quite as ghostly as we were told. So why did it decline? What happened to the cities? For a long time, the favorite explanation among scholars was the Aryan invasion. The civilization declined because it was conquered by incoming peoples who destroyed it. This is appealing in its simplicity. It has a villain and a mechanism and a definite historical moment. The evidence does not support it. There are no mass graves at Mohenjo-daro or Harappa of the kind associated with conquest and massacre. There is some evidence of violence, a small number of skeletal remains showing signs of trauma, but nothing remotely consistent with the systematic destruction of two cities housing tens of thousands of people. The cities did not burn. They did not fall suddenly. They declined gradually, over centuries, in a process that looks far more like abandonment than defeat. What actually happened seems to have been a combination of factors, all converging in the second millennium BCE. Climate change was almost certainly the primary driver. The monsoon patterns that had fed the rivers and the agriculture of the Indus Valley began to shift. A river system called the Gagar-Hakra, which may have been the ancient Sarasvati River celebrated in Vedic hymns, appears to have gradually dried up as its Himalayan glacier sources changed course. Without reliable water, the elaborate agricultural system that fed the cities could not be maintained. Populations dispersed, moving east toward the Gangetic Plain, where water was more available. The great cities were not destroyed. They were slowly, quietly walked away from. This, too, is a pattern. Not the dramatic collapse of conquest and fire, but the slow dissolution of a system that can no longer sustain itself. The infrastructure becomes maintenance the population cannot afford. The center cannot hold not because an enemy broke it, but because the conditions that made it possible have silently shifted. The cities emptied. The bricks were reclaimed. The script fell silent. And the extraordinary civilization that had built the most sophisticated urban drainage system in the ancient world passed out of memory. So completely that the railway workers who quarried its ruins in the 1850s did not have even a legend to tell them what they were destroying. There is a particular cruelty in that silence. And it was not accidental. The archaeologist John Marshall, who led the excavations of Mohenjo-daro in the 1920s, immediately recognized the significance of what he had found. He wrote in 1931 that the Indus Valley civilization was at least as developed as the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and in some respects ahead of them. He said this clearly and on the record. But the institutional structures of British colonial archaeology and the broader intellectual culture of the era were not designed to amplify that message. They were designed to manage it, to absorb the discovery into existing frameworks, rather than allowing it to detonate those frameworks. The Indus Valley became a fascinating anomaly, an impressive but isolated achievement, not a civilization that demanded a fundamental rethinking of the map. The rethinking happened anyway. Eventually, slowly, incompletely, the map has been revised in academic circles, though the revision has not yet fully penetrated the popular version of the story, the one taught in schools, repeated in documentaries, displayed in the introductory galleries of major museums. Walk into most natural history museums in Europe or North America today, and count how many exhibit cases are devoted to ancient Mesopotamia. Then count how many are devoted to the Indus Valley. The disproportion is not subtle. It reflects not the relative importance of the two civilizations by geographic and demographic measures. The Indus Valley was larger, but the relative importance that was assigned to them by the people who built the museums. And the Indus Valley is not the only civilization that was assigned a lesser importance. Not by a long way. The story of erasure runs deeper and darker than any single archaeological oversight, because the Indus Valley at least has been excavated. At least it has been acknowledged. Even if its acknowledgement is incomplete, at least the bricks and the seals and the drains are in museums now, not under railway tracks. There are civilizations, or more precisely, there are aspects of civilizations that were not merely undervalued. They were actively destroyed. Their records were burned. Their monuments were demolished. Their intellectual traditions were dismissed as superstition or magic or primitive religion, and the people who carried them were told, sometimes at gunpoint, to forget what they knew. We are talking about Africa, and this is not a peripheral story. It is not a chapter about the margins of civilization. It is about the center, about the continent where the human story actually began, about civilizations that built in stone and in knowledge and in cultural tradition for thousands of years before European explorers arrived and decided, for reasons that had everything to do with economics and power and nothing to do with evidence, that what they were looking at was not history. This is erasure that cuts deepest, and it demands to be told in full. In the year 1464, a young king came to power in the western Sudan, in the great bend of the Niger River, in a city called Gao. His name was Suniali, and what he built over the next 28 years was an empire so vast, so militarily sophisticated, and so economically dominant that it controlled more territory than any European kingdom of the same era. His cavalry swept across the savannah. His war canoes ruled the Niger. His administrators governed cities that were, by any honest measure, among the most cosmopolitan places on earth at that moment in history. He was not an anomaly. He was not an exception. He was a product of tradition of statecraft and urban civilization in West Africa that stretched back more than 1,000 years before his birth. A tradition that had already produced the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the libraries of Timbuktu, the gold trade networks that connected the Sahara to the Mediterranean, and a scholarly class so accomplished that the University of Sankore in Timbuktu attracted students and intellectuals from across the Islamic world. None of this was primitive. None of this was pre-civilizational. None of this was the absence of history. But when European writers of the 18th and 19th centuries looked at Africa, this is not what they described. And what they described instead, a continent of savagery and stasis, a land without history, a place where nothing of consequence had ever been built or thought or achieved, was not an honest mistake born of limited evidence. It was a lie, assembled piece by piece, over decades, in the service of an economic system that required human beings to be property. And that lie did not stay in the 18th century. It traveled. It was embedded in institutions, in curricula, in the framing of museums and the writing of encyclopedias, and the silent assumptions of 1,000 subsequent histories that began their story of human civilization somewhere other than where the human story actually began. Let us go back to the beginning, the actual beginning. The human species, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa. This is not contested. The fossil evidence, the genetic evidence, and the archaeological evidence all point to the same conclusion. Modern humans evolved on the African continent, almost certainly in eastern or southern Africa, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. For the vast majority of human existence, for roughly 90% of the time that anatomically modern humans have been alive, every human being who ever lived was African. And during that vast stretch of time, on that continent, human beings were not simply waiting for something to happen. They were developing language, developing art, developing complex social structures, developing capacity for abstract thought and long-range planning that would eventually produce everything we call civilization. The oldest known abstract engravings in the world, geometric patterns scratched into ochre, were found at Blombos Cave in South Africa. They date to approximately 75,000 years ago. The oldest known mathematical object in the world, a baboon fibula with deliberate notches cut into it in what appears to be a numerical sequence, was found at Border Cave, also in South Africa. It is approximately 43,000 years old. 43,000 years old. This is not the product of a people without history. This is a product of a people with a history so long that it makes every other chapter of the human story look recent. And yet Hegel, the great German philosopher whose ideas shaped the intellectual architecture of the 19th century, wrote in 1830 that Africa was not a historical part of the world. He said it had no movement, no development, no history to exhibit. He wrote this in philosophy of history that was taught in universities across Europe, that shaped the thinking of an entire generation of scholars and administrators and colonial officials. He wrote it despite the fact that, at the very moment he was writing, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe were standing exactly where they had always stood, in the highland plateau of what is now Zimbabwe, testifying in stone to a civilization of extraordinary ambition and skill. Hegel had no excuse. The information existed. He chose not to see it. Great Zimbabwe. The name means House of Stone in the Shona language. And it is exactly that. An enormous complex of stone enclosures, walls, and towers built without mortar, using a technique of such precision that the walls have stood for more than 600 years without crumbling. The outer wall of the great enclosure, the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa, is over 250 meters in circumference, nearly 11 meters high in places, and built from an estimated 900,000 individual granite blocks, each shaped and fitted by hand. The construction required a workforce of thousands, sustained over generations, organized by a state with the administrative capacity to direct large-scale collective labor over long periods of time. Inside the enclosure, archaeologists have found evidence of an economy connected to trade networks reaching from the East African coast to China. Chinese porcelain, Persian glass beads, gold in quantities that explained why this place had been the center of a trading empire. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe, which controlled the gold and ivory trade routes between the interior of southern Africa and the Swahili coast from roughly the 11th to the 15th century CE. When European explorers first described Great Zimbabwe in the 19th century, they concluded, almost universally, that it could not have been built by Africans. They said it must have been Phoenicians, or Arabs, or perhaps the ancient queen of Sheba, who was said in the Bible to come from a land of gold. Theories multiplied. Some were presented as serious academic scholarship. All of them shared a single underlying premise, that the African people who actually lived on this land could not have built this, could not have organized this, could not have sustained this. Because if they could, the intellectual framework that justified colonizing them, enslaving them, and erasing their history would collapse. The actual builders were the Shona people. Their descendants still live in Zimbabwe. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe was their achievement, their civilization, their story. The colonial authorities knew this. They buried the evidence anyway. The first systematic excavator of Great Zimbabwe, an Englishman named Richard Hall, physically destroyed the archaeological layers that would have proven African authorship, ripping out the strata that contained the evidence, in the name of cleaning up the site. He was later reprimanded by the British Association for the deliberate destruction of evidence, but the damage was done. And for the entire period of Rhodesian colonial rule, from roughly 1890 to 1980, the official government position was that Great Zimbabwe had not been built by Africans. Teaching the African origin of Great Zimbabwe was, at certain points, illegal, literally illegal. A government that needed to maintain the fiction of African incapacity for civilization made it a crime to tell the truth about one of the greatest monuments on the continent. Let's go north. Let's go to the place the standard map does acknowledge, but only partially. Egypt. Ancient Egypt is universally acknowledged as one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the Book of the Dead, the astronomical precision of the temples, the remarkable continuity of a culture that persisted, recognizable and coherent, for more than 3,000 years. Nobody disputes the achievement. What is disputed, or rather, what was disputed for a very long time, and what is still contested in ways that reveal the underlying anxieties of the conversation, is a question of what ancient Egyptians actually looked like, of where Egyptian civilization came from, of how much of it was an indigenous African achievement, and how much was imported or hybridized or somehow derivative of influences from outside the continent. This debate has been intense, often bad-tempered, and deeply political. It has produced both serious scholarship and serious nonsense on multiple sides. But underneath all the heat, there are some things that the evidence makes very clear. Ancient Egypt was an African civilization. Geographically, culturally, and in terms of its deepest origins, it was rooted in Africa. The Nile Valley connects Egypt directly to the cultures of Nubia and Sudan to its south, cultures that are, by every measure, sub-Saharan African. The pre-dynastic cultures that preceded and gave rise to dynastic Egypt, the Badarian, the Naqada, developed in the Nile Valley, drawing on traditions of cattle herding, burial practice, and material culture that had deep roots in Sahara and the African interior. The Sahara was not always a desert. For most of the period between 10,000 and 5,000 BC, the period when Egyptian civilization was taking shape, the Sahara was a relatively green, well-watered region inhabited by pastoralists who left behind some of the most extraordinary rock art on Earth. As the Sahara dried, in a gradual climate shift driven by changes in Earth's axial tilt, the people who had lived there migrated, east toward the Nile, south toward the savannah. They brought their cattle, their cosmological traditions, their knowledge of the sky. The astronomer and researcher Thomas Brophy and others have pointed to evidence from a site in southern Egypt called Nabta Playa, a prehistoric ceremonial site in the eastern Sahara, where stone circles in alignment appear to track astronomical phenomena with a precision and intentionality that suggests organized astronomical observation. More than 6,000 years ago, Nabta Playa predates Stonehenge. It predates the earliest dynastic period in Egypt, and it was built by the cattle-herding people of the African Sahara. Egypt did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from Africa, from a long, continuous African tradition of cultural and spiritual development that the standard map either ignores entirely or acknowledges only as a vague pre-civilizational background. But Egypt is not even the deepest cut. The deepest cut is further south and further back. The kingdom of Kush, centered in what is now Sudan, immediately south of Egypt, is one of the most underrepresented major civilizations in popular history. At its height, Kush controlled an empire stretching from the confluence of the Blue and White Niles northward through most of Egypt. In the 8th century BC, Kushite pharaohs ruled Egypt as its 25th dynasty, black African kings sitting on the throne of one of the world's oldest civilizations, restoring temples, patronizing the arts, and fighting off the Assyrian Empire that was pressing from the north. These kings built pyramids. More pyramids, in fact, than Egypt itself ever built. There are more ancient pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. 255, built over a period of nearly 1,000 years. They are steeper than the Egyptian pyramids, more slender, and they are largely unknown to the general public. They are not on the standard map. They do not appear in the elementary school units on ancient civilization. They are not the image that comes to mind when someone says the word pyramid. And yet, they are there. They have always been there. They are standing right now in the Sudanese desert, a few hours north of Khartoum, testified to a civilization of extraordinary duration and accomplishment that the standard history of the ancient world has systematically marginalized. Why? Because including Kush in the story, fully, centrally, with the way it deserves, would require acknowledging that the Egyptian achievement was not a self-contained Mediterranean miracle, but the southern end of a longer African civilizational tradition. It would require drawing the line of descent differently, not from Egypt northward to Greece and Rome and Europe, but from the African interior outward in multiple directions, including northward. It would require a different map. And the people who drew the map had reasons not to draw it that way. Let's talk about Timbuktu. Because Timbuktu has become a joke in English, a synonym for the end of the earth, for a place so remote it barely exists. And this is one of the cruelest linguistic ironies in the history of Western culture. Because Timbuktu, at its height in the 15th and 16th centuries, was one of the great intellectual cities of the world. The University of Sankore was not a small school. At its height, it enrolled somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 students, making it, by student population, one of the largest universities on earth at the time. It attracted scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond, studying theology, law, mathematics, astronomy, history, and medicine. The curriculum was sophisticated. The faculty accomplished. The libraries extensive. The libraries. This is the part that most people have never heard. The city of Timbuktu and the surrounding region of Mali still contains, today, somewhere between 300,000 and 700,000 ancient manuscripts. Handwritten texts in Arabic and in the indigenous African script called Ajami, covering subjects from Islamic jurisprudence to mathematics to astronomy to history to medicine to poetry. Many of these manuscripts date to the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. Some are older. They were written by African scholars in African cities at a time when much of Europe was still rebuilding from the collapse of Rome. The majority of these manuscripts have never been translated. Many have never been cataloged. They sat in private family collections for centuries, hidden during the Moroccan invasion of 1591, hidden again during the colonial period when Islamic scholarship was suppressed, hidden again during the Islamist occupation of northern Mali in 2012, when extremist fighters who had declared the manuscripts idolatrous began to burn them. Local scholars and librarians loaded thousands of manuscripts onto donkeys and boats and smuggled them south to the capital, Bamako, risking their lives to save the written heritage of a civilization that the world had been told did not produce written heritage. Think about that. African scholars risking their lives in the 21st century to save African manuscripts from the 12th century. Documents proving beyond any shadow of doubt that the people of West Africa had a sophisticated, literate, intellectually ambitious culture for 1,000 years before European contact. The lie was not just an academic error. It had to be actively maintained. And it was, at enormous cost to the people whose history was being erased. We cannot leave this chapter without naming what the lie was in service of. The argument that Africa had no history, no civilization, no capacity for complex political or intellectual achievement. This argument was not developed in a vacuum of pure scholarship. It was developed in the context of the Atlantic slave trade, which between the 15th and 19th centuries forcibly transported somewhere between 12 and 15 million African human beings across the ocean to labor on plantations that produced the wealth that built the modern economies of Western Europe and North America. Making this possible, making it psychologically and morally sustainable for societies that participated in it, required a prior argument, the argument that the people being enslaved were not fully people in the historical sense, not people with civilizations of their own, not people with histories worth remembering or traditions worth respecting, people who existed outside of history, who had contributed nothing and built nothing, and who could therefore be removed from their world without any meaningful loss to human civilization. The denial of African history and the institution of African slavery were not parallel developments that happened to coexist. They were a single project. The history was denied because the slavery required it. And when the slavery ended, when it was abolished, after centuries of resistance and rebellion that are their own extraordinary story, the denial of the history did not end with it. It persisted. It was institutionalized in universities, in museums, in the intellectual frameworks of the disciplines that were supposed to be devoted to discovering truth. It took on a life of its own, detached from its original economic purpose, sustained by the inertia of prestige and the discomfort of correction. The scholars who argue for African historical achievement, many of them African or African descended, people like Cheikh Anta Diop, Yosef Benjo Cannon, and later Ivan van Sertima, were for decades dismissed, marginalized, or ridiculed by the mainstream of the discipline. Their arguments were sometimes overstated, sometimes methodologically imperfect, but they were right about the central claim. And the vehemence with which that central claim was denied told you something important about what was really at stake. What was at stake was the map itself. Because if Africa has history, real history, deep history, a history of cities and libraries and observatories and empires and universities and philosophical traditions, then the map has to be redrawn, not just supplemented or annotated, but fundamentally redrawn. The line of civilization does not run from Mesopotamia to Greece to Rome to Europe, ascending in a straight, and righteous progression toward the modern world. It runs in many directions at once, from multiple point of origin, across all the inhabited continents, in patterns of influence and exchange and independent development that are vastly more complex and vastly more interesting than the simple story. And if the map has to be redrawn, then the story of who civilized whom has to be rethought. And if that story has to be rethought, then a great many things build on top of it. Legal systems, property arrangements, cultural hierarchies, national identities, the self-image of entire societies become uncomfortable in ways that powerful people have historically been extremely unwilling to tolerate. This is why the lie persisted. Not because the evidence was unclear. The evidence was never unclear to anyone who looked at it honestly, but because the consequences of honesty were too large, and the institutions that had benefited from the lie were too strong, and the people most harmed by the lie were not the people with the power to correct it. There is a detail I want to leave you with, because it is a kind of detail that makes you feel the weight of what was lost. In 2012, when Islamist extremists who had seized northern Mali began to destroy the ancient mausoleums of Timbuktu saints, monuments that UNESCO had declared World Heritage Sites, a man named Abdulkader Haidara was coordinating the secret evacuation of the city's manuscripts. He was a librarian, the grandson of a scholar, a man whose family had preserved manuscripts across generations through invasion and drought and political upheaval, because they understood that what was written on those pages was irreplaceable. Haidara organized a network of volunteers who moved manuscripts in footlockers and metal trunks, carried by donkey and boat and truck, through checkpoints controlled by armed men who would have burned what they carried. He saved more than 300,000 manuscripts. His family alone had been preserving this collection for generations, preserving knowledge that the world had been told did not exist. He was not preserving a footnote. He was preserving the evidence that an entire chapter of the story of human civilization had been deliberately omitted, that the people of West Africa had been reading and writing and debating and thinking for centuries before anyone arrived to tell them they had never done any of those things. The manuscript survived. The lie, slowly, is not. But there is another part of the story that has been erased from almost every civilization we have examined so far. Not a geographic erasure, not an ethnic one, something closer to home, something that was present at the foundation of every city, every trade network, every religious institution, every agricultural revolution we have discussed, and was then systematically written out of the record by the very systems it helped create. We have talked about what was built. We have not yet talked fully about who built it. Half of humanity built it. The half that was then told it had built nothing at all. There is a grave in a cemetery outside the ancient city of Susa in what is now southwestern Iran. It dates to approximately 4,500 years ago, and when archaeologists opened it, they found the remains of a woman. She was buried with care, with jewelry, with tools, with the kind of object a society places alongside someone it considers significant. But what made this grave remarkable was not the objects. It was what analysis of her skeleton revealed. Her bones showed the particular pattern of stress fractures and joint deformation associated with a lifetime of intensive, repetitive manual labor. Specifically, the labor of grinding grain. Hours a day, every day, year after year, kneeling over a stone quern and pushing another stone across it, reducing grain to flour that would feed a family, a household, a city. She was not a minor figure buried with honorary gifts. She was a working woman, buried with the dignity her community believed she deserved, whose body told a story her grave goods confirmed. She had spent her life producing one of the most fundamental requirements of urban civilization. Without the flour she ground, without the bread that came from it, there would have been no city of Susa, no scribes sitting in temples recording beer rations on clay tablets, no kings proclaiming their glory on stone steels, no armies marching to expand the empire. She made all of it possible. She is not in the history books. She is not an exception. She is every woman who ever lived in the ancient world. Let's establish something clearly at the outset, because this chapter is going to cover ground that is sometimes misunderstood or misrepresented in both directions. This is not an argument that ancient societies were secret matriarchies, or that women secretly ran everything while men got the credit. The evidence does not support that claim, and making it would not be honest. What the evidence does support, overwhelmingly, across multiple cultures and multiple millennia, is something more specific and in some ways more disturbing. Women were not passive recipients of civilization. They were active, essential contributors to its construction. In many cases, they were its primary architects in the domains that mattered most for daily survival and cultural reproduction. And then, as civilizations became more complex, more hierarchical, and more focused on accumulating power and recording it, women's contributions were systematically written out of the record. Their roles contracted, their authority diminished, and the story was rewritten to suggest they had never really been there at all. This was not inevitable. It was not natural. It was a choice, made incrementally over thousands of years by the people who held the stylus and the sword and the seal. And understanding how it happened tells us something essential about how civilization works and what it costs. Start at the beginning, the actual beginning, agriculture. The technological revolution that enabled everything we call civilization was almost certainly invented by women. This is not a romantic claim or a piece of feminist revisionism. It is a consensus of modern anthropology, built on decades of ethnographic research across hunter-gatherer societies worldwide, combined with the archaeological record of early agricultural development. In virtually every hunter-gatherer society we have observed or documented, the division of labor follows a consistent pattern. Men hunt, women gather, and gathering is not the lesser half of that equation. In most hunter-gatherer environments, gathered plant foods, roots, tubers, seeds, fruits, nuts, legumes, provide the majority of the caloric intake, sometimes as much as 80%. Hunting provides protein and fat and the drama and prestige that tend to dominate the oral record. But the steady, reliable, daily work of feeding a community is done largely by women, and it is women, therefore, who develop the deepest knowledge of plants, which ones are edible and which are toxic, which produce seeds that can be stored, which grow back reliably in the same place year after year, which respond to disturbance, to digging, to clearing, by producing more abundantly. This knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years of close daily observation, is the intellectual foundation of agriculture. The step from gathering to planting, from noticing that seeds grow where they fall, to deliberately placing seeds where you want them to grow, is a step that required someone who already understood plants intimately enough to recognize the opportunity. The evidence strongly suggests that someone was, in most cases, a woman. The first cultivated plants were not the dramatic, large-scale grain crops we associate with civilization. Wheat and barley and rice. They were smaller, more personal plants, gourd for containers, herbs for medicine and flavoring, plants that grew near settlements, tended casually at first, then more deliberately. This is not the agriculture of state-organized fields and storage systems. This is the agriculture of household gardens, managed by the people who spent most of their time near the settlement, women and children and the elderly. From the household garden, over thousands of years, came everything else. The grain field, the irrigation ditch, the granary, the city. Women invented the technology that made civilization possible. And then civilization, as it grew and organized and hierarchized, took that technology away from them and placed it in the hands of male administrators, male priests, and male landowners. Let's look at what the earliest written records actually tell us before the record was consolidated and sanitized. In Sumer, returning to the civilization we know best, because it left the most written evidence. The earliest economic texts reveal a world in which women's labor was not peripheral, but central to functioning of the temple economy. The great temples of Sumerian cities were not just religious buildings. They were economic institutions, the largest employers, the largest landholders, the largest food processors in the city. And the records of these institutions show, unmistakably, that women performed a huge proportion of the specialized skilled labor that kept them running. Women wove textiles. This sounds modest until you understand what textile production meant in the ancient economy. Cloth was not a consumer product. It was a currency. The temples of Sumer exported cloth across the known world, to Anatolia, to the Indus Valley, to Egypt, in exchange for metals and stones and timber that the flat alluvial plain of Mesopotamia lacked. The women who sat at the looms in the temple workshops were not domestic servants. They were industrial workers, producing the primary export commodity of one of the ancient world's major economic powers. The scale of this operation was extraordinary. Texts from the city of Lagash describe a single textile workshop employing more than 6,000 women and children. 6,000. Producing cloth in quantities that supplied both domestic consumption and international trade. This was not a cottage industry. This was a factory, run by an institution, staffed almost entirely by women. Some of these women were free. Some were what the text called temple dependents, people, often prisoners of war or the destitute poor, who lived and worked within the temple compound in conditions that ranged from something like indentured servitude to something we would recognize as slavery. The temple economy was not a kind institution, but it was an institution in which women's skilled labor was indispensable, recognized, and tracked, because tracking it was necessary for the administration of the whole system. What happened to these women? As civilization advanced was not liberation. It was the opposite. As textile production became more economically important, male administrators took increasing control of the workshops that had previously been managed by women. As trade networks expanded, the men who ran the trade networks accumulated wealth and influence that the women who produced the goods did not share in. The labor remained female. The profit became male. This is a pattern so consistent across so many ancient cultures that it cannot be coincidental. In every domain where women's work was central, food processing, textile production, pottery making, ritual practice, healing, the pattern repeats. Women innovate and sustain. The domain becomes economically or politically significant. Men move in and take institutional control. Women are pushed to the margins of the domain they created. Now, let's talk about religion. Because if there is one area where the erasure of women's historical role is most complete and most consequential for everything that follows, it is religion, the earliest evidence of organized religious practice. The burials, the carved figurines, the ritual sites like Göbekli Tepe does not tell us who the officiants were. The stone does not speak clearly enough of that, but it tells us something about who was considered symbolically significant. Carved figurines of the human form from the Upper Paleolithic period, from 30,000 years ago onward, are overwhelmingly female. The famous Venus figurines, found across a wide arc from Western Europe to Siberia, depict women with exaggerated reproductive features. Large breasts, wide hips, prominent bellies. Scholars have debated their meaning endlessly. Fertility symbols, goddess representations, self-portraits made by women, good luck charms for hunters. No consensus exists, but the consistent emphasis on the female form across such a wide geography and such a long time period is not nothing. It suggests that femininity, and specifically the female body's capacity for creation and reproduction, held a central symbolic significance in the religious imagination of early human communities. Not because ancient people were egalitarians in some idealized sense, but because the most visible and undeniable form of creation they had direct access to was a woman giving birth. By the time we reach the first urban civilizations, the symbolic centrality has been institutionalized. Every major Mesopotamian city had a patron deity, and many of the most powerful of those deities were female. Inanna, later known as Ishtar in Akkadian, was a goddess of love, war, fertility, and political power. Her cult was among the oldest and most widespread in the ancient Near East. The most important ritual in the Sumerian religious calendar was a ceremony scholars called a sacred marriage, a symbolic, and perhaps sometimes literal, union between the king and a priestess representing the goddess, through which the fertility of the land and the legitimacy of the ruler were both renewed. The king derived his political authority, in part, from his ritual relationship with the goddess. The goddess, and the women who embodied her in the temple, held the power to legitimate or withhold that authority. This is not a peripheral arrangement. This is a theological foundation of Sumerian kingship, and the women who served as high priestesses of Inanna were not symbolic ornaments. They were political actors. They controlled temple resources. They adjudicated disputes. They maintained the ideological infrastructure that held the city-state together. We know this, in part, because of Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, whom we mentioned briefly in Chapter 3. Enheduanna served as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at the city of Uar, appointed to that position by her father as part of a political strategy to consolidate his empire. She was the most powerful woman in the world at the time, and possibly one of the most powerful people of any gender. And she was a writer of genius. Her hymns to Inanna rank among the most sophisticated literary works of the ancient world. But here's the detail that matters most for our story. After Sargon's empire began to fragment, Enheduanna was removed from her position by a political rival. She wrote a poem about it. The hymn to Inanna, also called the Exaltation of Inanna, that is simultaneously a work of religious literature and a political manifesto. She describes her removal, her suffering, her appeal to the goddess for restoration. And then she was restored. Her poem worked. Her language, her authority, her relationship to the divine feminine gave her a power that outlasted her political disgrace. That poem, written 4,300 years ago by a woman who had been removed from power and wrote her way back into it, survived. She did not vanish. She insisted on being remembered, but the tradition she represented, of women holding formal, recognized, politically significant sacred authority, did not survive in the same way. It eroded, gradually, then rapidly, as the political landscape of Mesopotamia shifted, as military conquest became the dominant mode of state formation, as the administrators of temple economies standardized and bureaucratized the systems that had once been overseen by women of charismatic religious authority, the space for women at the top of the religious hierarchy contracted. The goddesses remained. Inanna remained. She was too deeply embedded in the symbolic architecture of the civilization to be erased. But the women who had embodied her, who had exercised real power in her name, were slowly replaced by male priests, male administrators, male legal codes that placed women's bodies and women's labor under the authority of husbands and fathers. Across the ancient world, this story repeated with variations. In ancient Egypt, women held legal rights and social status that would not be matched in Europe until the 19th century. Egyptian women could own property, conduct business, initiate divorce, inherit independently, and appear in court without a male guardian. Female pharaohs existed, most famously Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt as a full pharaoh for more than 20 years in the 15th century BCE, organized major trading expeditions, commissioned some of the most beautiful monuments of the New Kingdom, and was then systematically erased from the record by her successor, Thutmose III, who had her images defaced and her name chiseled from inscriptions. She was good enough to rule Egypt. She was not good enough to be remembered ruling it. So the memory of her rule was destroyed, stone by stone, image by image, and for more than 3,000 years she was lost. It was only in the 20th century, when Egyptologists began to piece together the evidence behind the erasure, that she was recovered. In the Indus Valley civilization, we cannot read the script and cannot say definitively who held authority, but the material evidence offers some suggestive details. The figures depicted on Indus seals include a female figure, sometimes shown standing in a tree, sometimes in a pose that suggests ritual authority, who appears frequently enough and consistently enough to suggest she was a significant deity or symbolic figure. Whether women held formal religious or political authority in Indus Valley society, we cannot say, but the symbolic presence of the female is undeniable. In prehistoric Britain, the construction of the great megalithic monuments, the long barrows, the stone circles, the elaborate chambered tombs that the landscape from the Orkneys to Cornwall was a community project. The people buried in these monuments, according to isotopic and genetic analysis of skeletal remains, were not primarily male warriors or chiefs. They were men and women together. The long barrows appear to have served as communal ancestral houses. Places where the bones of the dead, male and female, were curated and consulted by the living. The dead were not ranked by gender. They were ranked by belonging. This is not paradise. These were still societies with hierarchies and violence, and all the familiar human ugliness. But the hierarchy was not yet the specifically gendered hierarchy that would come to dominate the later Bronze Age and Iron Age worlds. That hierarchy arrived with conquest, with the chariot cultures that swept across Eurasia in the second millennium BCE. Carry with them the patrilineal clan structures and sky god worship and warrior aristocracies that would eventually become the dominant social model of the ancient world. The shift was not gradual everywhere. In some places, it was sudden, violent, a replacement of one social order with another, imposed by people with better weapons, and a different set of ideas about who should be in charge. But the erasure was never complete. It could not be, because the actual work of civilization, The daily labor of feeding, clothing, healing, teaching, and maintaining the fabric community life remained largely in women's hands regardless of what the political and legal superstructure said about their status. In ancient Greece, the civilization that the Western tradition most likes to claim as its intellectual ancestor, women were formally excluded from public life in Athens to a degree that was extraordinary even by ancient standards. Athenian women of citizen class were confined to the domestic sphere, unable to vote, to own property independently, to appear in public courts, or to participate in the philosophical discussions that were supposedly the great achievement of the culture. And yet, the domestic economy of Athens was entirely managed by women. The production of textiles, the primary manufactured good of the ancient Greek world, was a female enterprise, from the spinning of raw wool to the weaving of finished cloth. The religious life of the city depended on female participation in ways that could not be eliminated without dismantling the religion itself. The festival of the Thesmophoria, one of the most important religious events in the Athenian calendar, was conducted exclusively by women, closed to all male observation. What happened inside that festival was, literally, a state secret known only to the women who participated. The Pythia, the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, was a woman. The most consulted, most politically influential, most widely feared religious authority in the Greek world was a woman sitting on a tripod over a volcanic fissure, breathing vapors, and uttering prophecies that kings and generals and city-states organized their entire strategic decisions around. You could not consult the greatest strategic intelligence resource in the ancient Greek world without going through a woman. And yet Athenian women had no legal personhood. They were, in the eyes of the law, perpetual minors under guardianship of their nearest male relative. The contradiction is so stark it forces a question. How does a civilization build an ideology of female subordination while simultaneously depending, at its deepest functional levels, on female knowledge, female labor, and female spiritual authority? The answer is that it manages the contradiction through selective visibility. What women do that supports the system is absorbed, normalized, rendered invisible as labor, just the natural order of things. What women do that might confer authority or status is controlled, contained, ritualized in ways that limit its political implications. The Pythia speaks for Apollo, not for herself. Her words are mediated by male priests who translate the utterance into coherent pronouncements. The power flows through her, but it does not belong to her. This is a machinery of erasure, not a sudden deletion, but a constant, structural process of absorption and invisibility. By the time we reach the first millennium BCE, the period of the great axial age philosophers of Confucius and Buddha, and the Hebrew prophets and the Greek thinkers, the theological architecture of most of the major civilizations has been significantly masculinized. The great sky gods, Zeus, Jupiter, Yahweh, Indra, the Vedic Varuna, dominate the pantheons or stand alone as a singular divine authority. The female deities that survive do so in contracted roles, goddesses of love and fertility, of the hearth and the home, of the moon and the underworld, domains that are important, but that are clearly subordinated to the male domains of sky, thunder, law, and war. This is not an accident of religious imagination. It reflects and reinforces a social order. When the dominant god is male, patriarchal authority is cosmologically guaranteed. When the king rules by divine right, and the divine is imagined as supremely masculine, the exclusion of women from political power is not a human choice. It is the order of the universe. The Sumerian legal reforms of the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the Code of Hammurabi in the 18th century BC, the Mosaic Law of the Hebrew Bible, the laws of Manu that codified Hindu social structure in the first centuries of the Common Era. All of these legal systems, developed in the civilizations that the standard map treats as the foundations of our world, contain explicit restrictions on women's autonomy that were justified not merely by practical argument but by theological necessity. Women were subordinate because God, or the gods, made them so. And if God made them so, then arguing otherwise was not just socially deviant. It was impious. It was dangerous. It was a challenge to the cosmic order itself. This is the full depth of the erasure. It was not merely historical. It was metaphysical. The subjugation of women was written into the architecture of meaning, into the story civilizations told about how the world was made and who it was made for. And yet the resistance never stopped. In every civilization, in every era, women found ways to exercise authority, to preserve knowledge, to maintain traditions, and to insist on their own humanity in the face of systems designed to deny it. Sometimes quietly, through the management of households that were the actual units of economic life. Sometimes publicly, through the exercise of religious authority that could not be entirely stripped away without destroying the religion. Sometimes through writing, the records that survive against all institutional pressure not to survive, that give us Enheduanna and Sappho and Hildegard von Bingen and countless others whose names we know and the far larger number whose names we do not. The history of women in civilization is not a history of absence. It is a history of presence made invisible, a history of labor unacknowledged, of authority unrecorded, of knowledge transmitted through channels, oral tradition, household practice, midwifery, herbalism, textile craft, that the literate, administrative record did not consider worth noting. When that record is the only record we have, the absence feels like evidence. It feels like these women were not there, were not significant, were not doing anything worth remembering. They were there. They were significant. They were doing the work that made everything else possible. The question is not why they disappeared from history. They did not disappear. The question is why history was organized in a way that made them invisible. And the answer to that question is the same answer we keep finding in every chapter of the story. Because the people who built the record had reasons, institutional, political, theological, and economic reasons, to build it the way they did. We have now looked at three kinds of erasure. The erasure time, the assumption that complex human behavior began with agriculture. The erasure geography, the assumption that civilization belonged to a narrow corridor of cultures. And the erasure gender, the assumption that civilization was built by men. All three of these erasures serve the same function. They simplified a story that is actually staggeringly complex. They create a straight line in a history that was always moving in multiple directions at once. They produce a map that flattered the people who drew it. But there is one more kind of erasure we have not yet reckoned with. One that is not about who gets credit for building civilization, but about what happens when the civilizations that are built, with all their extraordinary achievement, all their accumulated knowledge, all their complex social arrangements, simply stop. Not because they are conquered, necessarily. Not because their people disappear, but because the system fails. Because the web of dependencies that made the whole extraordinary structure possible becomes too fragile to sustain itself. Because the climate shifts or the trade routes break, or the elite extracts too much from the base, or the infrastructure demands more maintenance than the population can provide. Because civilization, for all its grandeur, is not a permanent condition. It is a performance. A sustained, collective, enormously demanding performance. And sometimes, in the middle of performance, everything goes dark. In the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC, it happened on a scale so sudden and so complete that modern historians still argue about what caused it. Cities that had stood for centuries burned and were never rebuilt. Trade networks that had connected a dozen cultures across the Mediterranean and the Near East collapsed almost simultaneously. Writing systems disappeared. Populations crashed. The world that had existed for more than 1,000 years simply ended. It was, by any measure, one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. And almost nobody has heard of it. In the summer of approximately 1286 BC, two of the most powerful men on earth met on a field in what is now northern Syria and tried to destroy each other. On one side, Ramesses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, commanding an army of perhaps 20,000 men divided into 4 divisions named after the gods Ra, Ammonius, Ta, and Set. On the other side, Muwatalli II, king of the Hittite Empire, with a force that ancient records claim numbered 37,000 infantry and 3,500 chariots. The Battle of Kadesh was the largest chariot battle in history. It was also, in some sense, a performance, a tremendous, catastrophic clash of civilizational ambitions that ended without a decisive victory for either side. Ramesses carved the story of his personal heroism into the walls of temples across Egypt, claiming triumph in language so extravagant it borders on comedy. The Hittites carved their own version, which describes a rather more ambiguous outcome. What happened next was more significant than the battle itself. The two empires sat down and negotiated. They signed a peace treaty, the earliest surviving peace treaty in recorded human history, the text of which still exists in both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Hittite cuneiform, and a replica of which hangs today on the wall of the United Nations headquarters in New York. They agreed on borders. They exchanged prisoners. They corresponded warmly for decades, their kings addressing each other as brothers, their queens writing to each other with what reads, across 3,000 years of distance, like genuine affection. This was the Bronze Age world at its height, a world of sophisticated diplomacy, long-distance trade, cultural exchange, and institutional complexity that had been building for more than 1,000 years. A world so densely interconnected that a shipwreck found off the coast of Turkey, the Uluburn wreck, dating to approximately 1300 BC, contained cargo from at least 11 different cultures: Egyptian gold and glass, Canaanite amphory, Cypriot copper ingots, Baltic amber, African ebony, tin from Afghanistan, olives from Greece, and luxury goods from as far away as Italy. The world of 1200 BCE was, in its own terms, globalized. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was not a collection of isolated kingdoms, occasionally bumping into each other. It was a system, a tightly coupled, interdependent system of trade, diplomacy, and shared institutional practice that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, to the Hittite Empire, to the Mycenaean Greeks, to the cities of the Levantine coast, to the island of Cyprus, to the Aegean, and beyond. And within the space of roughly 50 years, between approximately 1200 and 1150 BC, almost all of it collapsed, not declined, not gradually contracted, collapsed. The word collapse is not an exaggeration. Let's be specific about what happened, because the specific details are more shocking than the general claim. The Mycenaean civilization of Greece, the civilization that fought the Trojan War, that built the palace of Mycenae with its massive lion gate, that maintained a sophisticated administrative system using a script called Linear B to track grain and bronze and sheep across an extensive palace economy, ceased to exist. The palaces were burned. In some cases, destroyed so completely that they were never rebuilt. The population of Greece dropped catastrophically, by estimates ranging from 50 to 75% over the course of a century. The Linear B script disappeared entirely, and with it, literacy. Greece entered a dark age that would last for roughly 400 years, after which completely different civilization, using a completely different script borrowed from the Phoenicians, rebuilt itself in the ruins with almost no institutional memory of what had come before. The Hittite Empire, the power that fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh, that controlled most of Anatolia and much of the Levant, that had maintained a sophisticated legal tradition and a diplomatic correspondence with the great powers of the age, also disappeared. The capital city, Hattusa, was burned and abandoned. The Hittite language, the Hittite royal family, the Hittite state, gone. So completely gone that when European scholars first began to encounter references to the Hittites in the Hebrew Bible in the 19th century, many of them thought the Hittites were fictional, a people described in the Old Testament who left no trace in the historical record. They left no trace because they had been erased not by later scholars but by the collapse itself. The great cities of the Levantine coast, Ugarit, Megiddo, Hazor, Lachish, among others, were destroyed. Ugarit, a sophisticated cosmopolitan port city that served as one of the primary nodes in the international trading network, was burned so suddenly that bread was still in the ovens when it fell. A clay tablet found in the ruins contained a message from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia in Cyprus, describing an attack by sea raiders and pleading for military assistance. The tablet was never sent. It was fired in the conflagration that destroyed the city, and it sat in the ashes for 3,000 years until archaeologists pulled it out and read the desperate words of a king who never received help. Cyprus was hit. The Aegean Islands were hit. The coasts of Anatolia were hit. Egypt survived, but only barely. Ramesses III fought off multiple attacks by what his inscriptions called the Sea Peoples, and the Egypt that emerged from the crisis was a diminished, contracting power, never again the dominant force it had been in the New Kingdom. The palace economies that had organized the Bronze Age world, the elaborate redistributive systems through which specialized craftsmen and farmers and administrators and soldiers were all fed and equipped and coordinated by centralized royal institutions, collapsed and did not rebuild. The merchant networks that had carried copper and tin and grain and textiles and luxury goods across thousands of kilometers of sea lanes and caravan routes went silent for generations. The Bronze Age was over. What came after was a darker, simpler, smaller world. Now, the question that historians have argued about for more than a century. What caused it? And the genuinely honest answer, which is also the most unsatisfying one, is that we do not know. Not completely. Not with a certainty that allows a single clean explanation. What we have is evidence of multiple simultaneous stressors, each one serious, together constituting a systemic failure of a complexity and totality that none of the people living through it could have fully understood. The first and most obvious candidate is the Sea Peoples. These are the raiders who appear in Egyptian records attacking from the sea, destroying cities, overwhelming the coastal cities of the Levant. They appear in Ramesses III's inscriptions as a confederacy of different peoples. The Peleset, the Checker, the Shikalesh, the Denyen, the Weshish, migrating en masse, bringing their wives and children on ox carts, not simply raiding but moving, looking for new places to settle. Who were the Sea Peoples? This is one of the most debated questions in Bronze Age scholarship. The most widely accepted view today is that they were themselves refugees, people displaced from other parts of the collapsing system, who then accelerated the collapse of the parts they reached. The Peleset are often identified with the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible, who settled on the southern Levantine coast. Some of the other groups may have been displaced Mycenaean Greeks or Anatolians, or Cypriots driven from their homes by the first waves of disruption, and then crashing into societies that had not yet fallen. If this reading is correct, and it has considerable support among modern scholars, then the Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse. They were a symptom of it, a massive, desperate human tide set in motion by forces that had already begun to dismantle the world. So what were those forces? Climate change comes first. Paleoclimatological research conducted in the last 20 years has produced growing evidence of prolonged drought in the eastern Mediterranean between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE. This was not a single bad year. It was a sustained multi-decade shift in rainfall patterns that reduced agricultural yields across a wide swath of the region, from Greece to Anatolia to Levant to Egypt's Nile Delta. The evidence comes from multiple independent sources. Pollen cores from lake sediments in Anatolia and the Levant show a dramatic decrease in tree cover during this period, consistent with prolonged drought. Isotopic analysis of cave formations in the region shows a corresponding shift in precipitation, and a textual record contains what might be the most haunting evidence of all. Among the tablets found at Ugarit, the city that was burned before its king's desperate letter could be sent, is a series of correspondence between Ugarit and its neighbors about grain. The king of Ugarit is asking Egypt for grain. Egypt is asking Cyprus for grain. Cyprus is saying it has no grain to send. The great grain-producing regions of the Bronze Age world were all simultaneously short of food at the same time in the years immediately before the collapse. When the food runs short, the palace economy, which depends on feeding its specialized workforce, cannot function. When the palace economy cannot function, it cannot maintain its military forces. When the military forces contract, the trade routes become vulnerable. When the trade routes become vulnerable, the supply of bronze, which required tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus to be combined in Levantine workshops and distributed by Aegean merchants, breaks down. When the bronze supply breaks down, the armies that defend the system cannot be equipped. When the armies cannot be equipped, the cities they protect fall. Each failure enables the next. The system, which had functioned because of its interconnections, now fails because of them. Every node in the network is a vulnerability. Every dependency becomes a vector of transmission for catastrophe spreading from somewhere else. This is the terrifying logic of systemic collapse. Not a single blow, but a cascade. Not one cause, but convergence. A tight network of interdependencies that worked magnificently in good times and became a catastrophic liability when conditions changed. But drought and the Sea Peoples are not the whole story. There's a third factor that modern scholarship has increasingly emphasized, and it is the one that feels most uncomfortably relevant to the present moment. The Bronze Age palace economies were, by the late second millennium BC, operating under extraordinary internal stress. The palace system was, at its core, a machine for extracting surplus from agricultural producers and redistributing it to an elite administrative and military class. It worked because the agricultural surpluses were large enough, and the extractive pressure was calibrated carefully enough to keep the system in balance. But over time, the elite grew, the administrative apparatus expanded. The military demands of a world of competing palace states required constant investment, and the pressure on the agricultural base increased accordingly. There is evidence in the Linear B tablets of Mycenae, in the administrative records of the Hittite Empire, in the economic texts of Ugarit, of a system under strain, of scribes recording increasingly desperate attempts to track and extract every last unit of agricultural output, of the population being pushed to the margins of subsistence to maintain an administrative and military superstructure that was growing faster than the economy supporting it. When the drought hit, there was no slack in the system to absorb it. The reserves were inadequate. The population had already been squeezed. The administrators who might have managed the crisis had built a system that functioned only when conditions were ideal, and conditions were no longer ideal. The result was not just economic hardship. It was what scholars call elite overproduction, a situation in which there are more people in the privileged administrative and military class than the economy can support, competing for a shrinking resource base. When that happens, the competition turns inward. Factionalism, internal conflict, the breakdown of the cooperative arrangements that kept the system functioning. The palace economies did not just fail because of external attack or climate disaster. In important ways, they failed because of their own success, because they had grown so large, so complex, so dependent on optimal conditions, that any significant disruption was more than they could withstand. Now, let's be specific about what was lost, because the scale of the cultural and institutional loss in the Bronze Age collapse is staggering, and it is important to feel the weight of it rather than simply catalog it. Writing disappeared in Greece for 400 years. This means that an entire civilization, one that had maintained detailed administrative records, that had participated in the diplomatic correspondence of the great powers, that had its own literature and its own religious traditions, lost the ability to record itself. What the Mycenaean Greeks knew, what they believed, what they traded, what they built, all of this passed out of written record and into oral tradition, where it transformed and simplified, and eventually became the raw material for Homer's epics, which were composed 400 years after the world they describe had ended. The Iliad and the Odyssey are not history. They are memory, the distorted, simplified, heroically inflated memory of a world that was gone, preserved through 4 centuries of oral transmission by people who could not write it down, because writing had been lost with the civilization that produced it. What else was lost? Diplomatic traditions built over centuries. Trade networks that had created, for the first time in human history, a genuinely international economy. Agricultural knowledge embedded in the palace redistributive systems, the knowledge of which fields to leave fallow, which irrigation channels to maintain, which seeds to reserve for the next planting. Craft traditions requiring specialized knowledge of metallurgy, of shipbuilding, of textile production, that could not survive the destruction of the institutions that organized and transmitted them. The Bronze Age collapse was not just the end of a political system. It was a cultural extinction event, a reset so severe that the civilizations that eventually rebuilt themselves in the Iron Age were, in important ways, starting over, drawing on fragments of memory, on the oral traditions that survived where writing had not, on the physical ruins of a world they could no longer fully interpret. The Greeks of the classical period, Plato and Aristotle and the playwrights of Athens, were separated from the Mycenaean world by an interval of time and cultural discontinuity roughly equivalent to the interval that separates us from the fall of the Roman Empire. They knew the Mycenaeans existed, in the way we know the Romans existed, through texts and ruins and legends. But they could not access that world directly. It was as foreign to them as it is to us. And Egypt, let's stay with Egypt for a moment, because Egypt is the instructive case. The civilization that survived, but at a cost. Egypt did not collapse in a way that Mycenae or Ugarit or Hattusa collapsed. The pharaonic state continued. The temples continued. The agricultural system of the Nile Valley, which depended on the annual flood rather than rainfall, and was therefore somewhat insulated from the drought that devastated the rain-fed agriculture of Anatolia and the Levant, continued to function. But Egypt was not the same after the collapse. The New Kingdom, the period of Ramesses the Great and the Battle of Kadesh and the extraordinary monuments of Luxor and Abu Simbel, ended. The third intermediate period that followed was a time of internal fragmentation, foreign domination, and reduced cultural ambition. The great building program stopped. The international trade networks that had brought cedar from Lebanon and gold from Nubia and copper from Cyprus contracted. Egypt turned inward. It survived, but it was diminished, and the diminishment was permanent. Egypt would never again be the dominant power it had been in the New Kingdom. The world had changed around it, and the version of Egypt that had made it great was a product of a world that no longer existed. This is a lesson that the Bronze Age collapse teaches, and it is a lesson that cuts uncomfortably close to the present. Complexity is not automatically stable. Interdependence is not automatically beneficial. A system that becomes sophisticated enough to dominate its environment also becomes sophisticated enough to destroy itself. When the conditions that made it possible change, whether through climate or conflict or internal contradictions, or all three at once, the very features that made the system powerful become the mechanisms of its failure. The historian Eric Klein, who has written the most thorough modern account of the Bronze Age collapse, uses a concept from complexity theory to describe what happened. He calls it a perfect storm, not in the casual sense, but in the technical sense of multiple independent stressors converging simultaneously on a system that had no redundancy, no slack, no ability to fail partially rather than completely. No single factor was sufficient on its own. The drought alone might have been survivable. The sea peoples alone might have been repelled. Internal social stress alone might have been managed through political reform. But all of them together, arriving at the same time, on a system that had been optimized for efficiency at the cost of resilience, that was too much. And the people who lived through it did not understand what was happening. They could not. They saw the effects. The burned city, the empty granary, the ships that stopped coming, the soldiers who did not arrive, without access to causes. They wrote their letters, carved their inscriptions, appealed to their gods, and then they were gone. The letters were fired in the ruins. The inscriptions were buried under the ash. The gods did not answer. What they left behind was silence. And from that silence, slowly, over centuries, new civilizations grew. Iron replaced bronze. Alphabets replaced syllabaries. City-states replaced palace economies. And the world that emerged from the collapse was, in some ways, more democratic, more accessible to ordinary people, less dependent on centralized palace control, precisely because the palace system had been destroyed. The Phoenicians who spread their alphabet across the Mediterranean, the Israelites who developed monotheism in the aftermath of the collapse, the Greeks who invented philosophy and democracy in the Iron Age that followed, all of them were, in part, the product of the collapse. They built on its ruins. They were shaped by the absence of what had been there before. Catastrophe, in other words, was also a kind of clearing, a brutal, devastating, entirely avoidable clearing, but a clearing nonetheless from the ashes of the Bronze Age world. The cultures that would most directly shape the Western tradition emerged. There is something deeply uncomfortable about that sentence. Let's sit with the discomfort, because what it says, if you follow it honestly, is that some of the things we value most about the civilization we inherited, Greek philosophy, alphabetic literacy, monotheistic religion, the idea of the individual citizen with rights, emerged from catastrophe, were shaped by catastrophe, may not have existed without it. The palace economy, for all its oppressiveness, for all the labor extraction and the rigid hierarchy and the centralized control, also maintained the infrastructure of a sophisticated world. When it fell, the infrastructure fell with it. The people who survived rebuilt without it, and what they built was different, more distributed, more locally organized, less dependent on centralized control. This does not mean the collapse was good. 50 to 75% of the population of Greece dying in a century is not good. Cities burned and abandoned are not good. 400 years of illiteracy are not good. The loss of accumulated knowledge and craft traditions and diplomatic institutions that had taken 1,000 years to develop is not good, but it is complicated. And the complication matters because it tells us something about the relationship between civilization and catastrophe that the triumphalist version of history, the version in which civilization is always ascending, always progressing, always moving forward, cannot accommodate. Civilization is not a straight line. It is a cycle, or rather, it is many cycles, interacting with each other in ways that sometimes produce extraordinary flourishing and sometimes produce catastrophic collapse, and often produce both at once in different parts of the world. The Bronze Age collapse was the most dramatic interruption of that cycle in the ancient world, but it was not the last. Rome fell, the classic Maya collapsed, the Tang dynasty fractured, the Abbasid Caliphate dissolved, the Mongol conquest depopulated Central Asia, the Black Death killed a third of Europe. Each of these was a version of the same dynamic. A complex system encountering conditions it was not built to handle, and failing in ways that cleared the ground for what came next. But here's the thing about these collapses that the standard history almost never says directly. They were not mysteries to the people who caused them or who failed to prevent them. The internal contradictions of the Bronze Age palace economies, the over-extraction, the elite overproduction, the reduction of resilience in the pursuit of efficiency, were visible to anyone paying attention. The texts show us administrators who knew the grain was running short, kings who knew their military capacity was stretched, scribes who recorded, in careful bureaucratic language, a system under impossible pressure. They knew, and they could not stop it, because the system was larger than any individual within it, because the incentives for each actor, each palace, each king, each administrator, pointed toward extracting more and building more and expanding more, even as the aggregate effect of all that extraction and building and expanding was making the system more fragile. Because the people who could have reformed the system were the people who benefited most from it continuing unchanged. This, too, is a pattern, and it is a pattern that we would be foolish to imagine ended with the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age collapse was not the last time civilization tried to erase its own contradictions by pretending they did not exist. And the people who came after the collapse, the people who built the Iron Age world, who wrote the texts that became the foundation of Western civilization, who told the stories that we still tell today, they rewrote the history of what had come before in ways that served their own purposes. They simplified the Bronze Age world into legend. They took the complexity and the interdependence and the sophisticated institutional arrangements and compressed them into heroes and monsters and divine interventions. They made the past legible. And in making it legible, they made it smaller. This is what empires and kingdoms and intellectual establishments do with history. They shape it. They select from it. They emphasize the parts that legitimate the present and minimize the parts that complicate it. They build the map they need, rather than the map that actually reflects the territory. This is not a modern invention. It is not a recent corruption of an otherwise pure scholarly tradition. It is as old as civilization itself. The first time a king carved his victories into a stone wall and carefully omitted his defeats, it was happening. The first time a priestly class edited the creation myths to make the male sky god supreme over the female earth powers, it was happening. The first time a colonial administrator looked at the ruins of an ancient city and decided it could not have been built by the people living nearby, it was happening. The rewriting of the past in the service of the present. This is the subject of the next chapter, and it may be the most important subject of all, because it is happening right now, and understanding how it has always worked is the only way to begin to see through it. In the year 213 BCE, the first emperor of unified China issued an order. His name was Qin Shi Huang. He had spent 25 years conquering the 6 rival kingdoms of the Chinese world, absorbing them one by one into a single centralized state, and then spent the next decade systematically dismantling every institution, every tradition, and every idea that did not serve his vision of what China should be. He standardized weights and measures. He standardized the axle width of carts. He standardized the written script so that a document produced in the far south could be read by an administrator in the far north. He built roads. He built walls. He built the administrative apparatus of the most populous state on earth. And then he burned the books. Not all books. The order was more specific than that. Technical books on agriculture, medicine, divination were permitted to survive. Books held by the Imperial Academy were preserved. What was to be destroyed was the historical and philosophical literature of the pre-imperial period, the records of the rival kingdoms whose separate histories constituted a rival claim to legitimacy, the texts of the Confucian scholars who argued that a ruler's authority derived from moral virtue rather than military force, the poetry and ritual manuals of a civilization that had existed before Qin Shi Huang decided what civilization was supposed to look like. The books were burned. The scholars who refused to surrender their texts, legend says 460 of them, were buried alive. This is the most dramatic version of something that has happened in virtually every civilization that ever existed. The systematic reshaping of the past to serve the needs of the present. The deliberate construction of a history that makes the current order of things seem not merely convenient, but inevitable. Not a political choice, but the natural culmination of everything that came before. Qin Shi Huang was not the first ruler to understand this. He was simply the most efficient. Let's be precise about what we mean by rewriting history, because the term is used so loosely that it has lost some of its force. We are not talking primarily about outright fabrication. Most historical rewriting does not involve inventing events that never happened. It is subtler than that. It works through selection, through emphasis, through the framing of what counts as significant and what can be safely ignored, through the choice of where the story begins and where it ends, through the decision about whose perspective is recorded and whose is allowed to fall silent. Every act of historical narration is an act of selection. There is no neutral position, no view from nowhere, no account of the past that does not reflect the assumptions and interests of the person producing it. This is not a cynical observation. It is simply a fact about how knowledge works. The question is not whether history is shaped by the perspective of its tellers. It always is. The question is how consciously, in whose interest, and with what consequences. When those consequences are that certain peoples, certain achievements, certain truths about the human past are systematically excluded from the record that everyone reads, the shaping of history stops being a philosophical problem about the nature of knowledge and becomes a political one about the distribution of power. And the political version of the problem is what this chapter is about. Start with the most basic mechanism, the mechanism of the archive. History survives where records survive. Records survive where institutions preserve them. Institutions preserve what serves their interests and discard or destroy what does not. This is not always a conscious decision. Sometimes it is simply inertia. The records of the powerful are kept because the powerful have the resources to keep them, and the records of the powerless are lost because the powerless do not. The result is a profound structural bias in the historical record. We know an enormous amount about ancient kings and their battles, their building projects, their religious claims, and their legal codes. We know very little about the lives of the farmers and craftspeople and slaves whose labor made all of that possible. We know the names of Mesopotamian kings from 5,000 years ago because those names were carved in stone. We do not know the name of a single one of the women who ground the grain that fed the cities, though there were tens of thousands of them and they worked every day of their lives. This is not a conspiracy. No one decided to erase the grinding women. The erasure is built into the structure of what gets recorded and what does not. Kings carve their names in stone because they have the resources and the desire for permanence. Grinding women do not carve their names in stone, and so the stone tells us about kings. But there are also cases where the erasure is deliberate, where specific records are destroyed, specific memories suppressed, specific truths about the past eliminated because they are inconvenient for the people who currently hold power. We have already seen this in action. Thutmose, the third chiseling Hatshepsut's name from the monuments. Colonial officials actively destroying the archaeological evidence of African urban civilization. Richard Hall ripping out the stratigraphic layers at Great Zimbabwe that would have proven African authorship. The Rhodesian government making it illegal to teach that Africans built Great Zimbabwe. These are the dramatic examples. But the everyday version is quieter and no less powerful. Consider how history is periodized. The way we divide the human past into chapters, ancient, medieval, modern, is itself a choice. And it is a choice made by people in a specific cultural tradition, with specific assumptions about what matters and what does not. The concept of the Middle Ages, the medieval period, was invented by Renaissance scholars who wanted to distinguish their own era of cultural rebirth from the supposedly dark period between the fall of Rome and their own time. The very name implies a hiatus, a waiting period between two moments of genuine significance. It implies that the 1,000 years between roughly 400 and 1400 CE were a gap in the story of civilization. This is nonsense from the perspective of anyone who was not in Western Europe during those 1,000 years. The Islamic Golden Age, the period from roughly the 8th to the 13th century during which Islamic scholars made foundational contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, chemistry, optics, and virtually every other field of human inquiry, was happening precisely during the European Middle Ages. The Song dynasty in China was producing the most sophisticated economy and the most advanced technology on Earth. The Mali Empire in West Africa was accumulating the wealth and the intellectual tradition that would produce Timbuktu. The Aztec and Maya civilizations in the Americas were building cities and developing astronomical calendars of extraordinary precision. None of this was a Middle Age. None of this was a gap in the story. It was a story happening in places that the European Renaissance scholars who invented the periodization were not paying attention to. But the periodization stuck. It is still the framework taught in most Western schools. Ancient, medieval, modern. 3 acts, with Europe at the center of all three, and everything else arranged around the edges as context or curiosity. Now, let's talk about the specific tools of historical rewriting, the techniques that have been used again and again by different civilizations in different eras to make the past say what the present needs it to say. The first and most powerful tool is the foundation myth. Every civilization produces a story about its own origins, a story that explains where it came from, why it is legitimate, and why its current arrangements, its social hierarchy, its distribution of power, its religious practices, its territorial claims, are correct and natural and divinely sanctioned. These stories are not history, though they borrow the language and the authority of history. They are myths, origin myths, and their function is not to describe the past accurately, but to legitimate the present powerfully. The foundation myths of Rome are a perfect example. The Romans told 2 origin stories simultaneously, and the tension between them tells you something important about what Roman civilization needed to believe about itself. The first story said Rome was founded by Romulus, a wolf-suckled orphan of divine descent, who drew a line in the earth with a plow and killed his brother for crossing it. From this act of fratricidal violence came the first city, the first laws, the first community of Roman citizens. The founding of Rome was an act of brutal, decisive, masculine will. It was a statement that Rome's origins lay in force and determination, that the city had willed itself into existence through the strength of its founders. The second story said Rome was descended from Aeneas, a Trojan prince who fled the destruction of Troy and wandered the Mediterranean before being guided by the gods to Italy, where his descendants would eventually build the greatest city in the world. This story connected Rome to the Greek cultural tradition, to Homer, to Troy, to the heroic world of the Iliad, and claimed for Rome a lineage of cultural legitimacy stretching back to the oldest remembered civilization of the Western world. These 2 stories serve different purposes. The Romulus story justified Roman power in terms of military force and masculine will. You are ruled by Rome because Rome is strong enough and determined enough to rule. The Aeneas story justified Roman power in terms of cultural destiny. You are ruled by Rome because Rome is the inheritor and fulfillment of the greatest civilization that came before it. Neither story was historical. The Romans knew this, at least partially. But that was beside the point. The point was not whether the stories were true. The point was what they made possible, what they legitimated, what they made the current order of things appear to be. This is what foundation myths do. In every civilization that has ever produced one, the Israelites told a foundation myth that gave a small, geopolitically marginal people a direct covenant with the creator of the universe. This was not a modest claim. It was one of the most audacious reframings of political reality in the history of human thought. A people who were, by the material measures of the ancient world, territory, army, wealth, political influence, decidedly minor, asserted that their smallness was not weakness but chosenness, that they mattered more than the great empires that surrounded them precisely because the God who made everything had chosen them above all others. This myth sustained a community through centuries of conquest, exile, and dispersal. It gave meaning to suffering that might otherwise have been simply annihilating. It created a form of cultural continuity that did not depend on territory or political sovereignty. It could survive exile because it was carried in the text rather than the land. But it also had consequences. The concept of a chosen people, of a group with a special covenant, a special destiny, a special claim on the attention of the divine, is not an innocent idea. It has been used in modified forms by every major empire the last 2,000 years to justify conquest, colonization, and the subordination of those deemed unchosen. The Puritan settlers of New England described their project in explicit Exodus language. They were the new Israelites, fleeing persecution to build a new Jerusalem in the Promised Land. The land was already inhabited. The people already that were cast implicitly in the role of the Canaanites, the people who occupied the Promised Land before it was claimed by the chosen. Foundation myths migrate. They detach from their original context, blend with new circumstances, and are weaponized by people who need them to authorize things the original myth makers never imagined. The second major tool of historical rewriting is what we might call the invention of tradition. This is a concept developed by the historians Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger in the 1980s, and it remains one of the most useful analytical tools in the historian's kit. The core insight is simple but devastating. Many of the practices, symbols, and institutions that appear ancient and natural and deeply rooted, and that derive much of their authority from that apparent antiquity, are actually quite recent inventions, deliberately constructed to create the appearance of tradition where none existed. The Scottish Highland tradition, the tartans, the clan system, the bagpipes as a symbol of Scottish national identity, was largely invented in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, partly by a literary forger named James Macpherson, who published what he claimed were ancient Gaelic epic poems, and partly by the enthusiasm of English Romantic writers and aristocrats who found the image of the noble Highlander aesthetically appealing. The actual Highlanders of the 17th century wore clothes that looked nothing like tartan kilts, and the clan system as it is now understood was a romanticized simplification of a much more complicated social reality. This does not make the tradition meaningless. Cultural traditions do not need to be ancient to be significant, but it does matter that the tradition was invented, because the people who invented it had specific purposes. They were constructing a Scottish national identity at a moment when the actual political autonomy of Scotland was under pressure, and the romantic version of Highland tradition served as a cultural compensatory myth, a way of asserting a distinct and dignified identity in the absence of political independence. The invention of tradition happens in every culture, in every era. The ancient Romans retroactively gave their republic a founding moment, a set of founding fathers, a constitutional tradition that was partly historical and partly mythologized to serve the needs of the imperial period. The medieval Catholic Church constructed elaborate genealogies of apostolic succession to demonstrate an unbroken institutional continuity stretching back to Christ himself, a continuity that was, by the standards of modern historical scholarship, considerably more constructed than continuous. European nations in the 19th century invented folk traditions, national epics, and cultural heritage programs to give recently unified or recently independent states the appearance of deep, organic historical roots. The pattern is consistent. When a political arrangement needs legitimacy, and it always needs legitimacy, it reaches for history. And if the history it needs does not exist, it creates the history it needs and then forgets that it created it. The third tool, and perhaps the most insidious, is the silence of curriculum. Not the burning of books, not the chiseling of names from walls, just the quiet, institutional decision about what gets taught and what does not, what appears in the textbooks that children read, what is included in the National Museum, what is commemorated in the national holidays, what is considered the essential background knowledge that every educated person is assumed to possess. In the United States, for most of the 20th century, the history curriculum in public schools told a story in which European civilization was the foundation of everything valuable, and the contributions of African, Asian, and indigenous American cultures were peripheral at best and invisible at worst. This was not accidental. It was a product of deliberate decisions made by curriculum designers, textbook publishers, school boards, and state legislatures who understood, at some level, that the story of society tells its children about the past shapes the kind of adults those children become and the kind of society they build. A child who grows up believing that civilization was invented by Europeans, sustained by Europeans, and reached its highest expression in European-descended cultures will navigate the world differently from a child who grows up knowing that cities were built in the Indus Valley 4,000 years before Columbus sailed, that the University of Timbuktu had 25,000 students when Oxford had a few hundred, that the mathematical foundations of the modern world were developed in large part by Islamic scholars working in Baghdad and Corinth and Cairo during the period Europeans call the Dark Ages. The curriculum is not a neutral transmission of established knowledge. It is a selection, and the selection encodes the assumptions, biases, and power arrangements of the people doing the selecting. This is why curriculum debates are so ferocious. Not because the specific facts in dispute are always of great practical importance, but because everyone involved understands, at some level, that the story a society tells its children about the past is an argument about what that society is and who it is for. Let's talk about archaeology. Because archaeology is supposed to be the discipline that gets behind a written record, that recovers the physical truth of the past without the bias of the textual tradition. And in important ways, it does. The bones do not lie about diet and health and life expectancy. The pottery does not lie about trade networks and craft traditions. The buildings do not lie about social organization and labor capacity. But archaeology is not immune to the politics of knowledge. Every excavation begins with a decision about where to dig. That decision reflects assumptions about where something interesting is likely to be found. And those assumptions reflect the theoretical frameworks and cultural biases of the archaeologists doing the deciding. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, European and American archaeologists focused their resources on sites in Europe, the Middle East, and Egypt, the regions that fit within the standard map of civilizational development. Sub-Saharan Africa was largely neglected. South and Southeast Asia were systematically underfunded relative to their actual archaeological significance. The Americas were studied primarily by anthropologists who framed indigenous cultures as ethnographic subjects, peoples to be observed in the present, rather than historical subjects, peoples with deep pasts worth excavating. The consequence is a massive unevenness in our knowledge of the human past. We know the Bronze Age Aegean in extraordinary detail. We know the third millennium Indus Valley in broad outlines and specific mysteries. We know almost nothing about the contemporary civilizations of West Africa, not because there is nothing to know, but because the work of knowing it has barely begun. This is changing. The last 30 years have seen a genuine expansion of archaeological effort into previously neglected regions. The results: the manuscripts of Timbuktu, the iron smelting traditions of sub-Saharan Africa that appear to predate those of Europe, the sophisticated urbanism of the Amazon basin that contradicts every assumption about what pre-Columbian civilization in South America looked like, are already forcing substantial revisions to the standard map. But the revisions are slow. Institutional knowledge is conservative. The frameworks built by a century of scholarship do not dissolve quickly, even when the evidence against them accumulates. There are careers and reputations and departmental budgets built on existing paradigms, and a human incentive to defend an existing paradigm against challenge is powerful and largely unconscious. There is a particular kind of historical rewriting that we have not yet addressed directly, and it is a kind that operates not through omission or distortion, but through narrative framing, through the choice of which story to tell when multiple stories are available. Consider the story of the encounter between the Spanish conquistadors and the Aztec Empire. That encounter is one of the most dramatic events in the history of human civilization. The collision of two worlds that have been developing in complete isolation from each other for 15,000 years. Two fully developed civilizations, each extraordinary in its own way, each operating on assumptions about how the world worked that made the other almost incomprehensible. The standard version of this story is well known. Hernán Cortés arrives in Mexico in 1519 with a few hundred soldiers. He forms alliances with peoples subjugated by the Aztecs. He marches to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, which his soldiers describe in stunned letters home as a city more beautiful and more impressive than anything they have seen in Europe. He is initially received peacefully by the Emperor Moctezuma. Then, through a series of events involving treachery, violence, and the catastrophic arrival of smallpox, which kills perhaps half the Aztec population in a matter of months, the empire falls. By 1521, Tenochtitlan has been razed and Cortés stands in the rubble of a civilization that had existed for 200 years. This version of the story is essentially accurate in its facts. But consider what it leaves out. It leaves out the internal politics of the Aztec Empire, the complex web of subject peoples, some of whom genuinely welcomed the Spanish as potential liberators from Aztec tribute demands, and whose military contribution was as important to conquest as Spanish weapons or disease. It leaves out the extraordinary military and organizational resistance of the Aztecs themselves, who fought a prolonged and often successful urban defense of Tenochtitlan that nearly destroyed the Spanish force before disease and starvation tipped the balance. It leaves out the intellectual traditions of the Aztec civilization, their astronomy, their philosophy, their poetic tradition, their sophisticated agricultural techniques. It leaves out the systematic destruction of Aztec manuscripts, the codices that contain their historical records, their religious knowledge, their astronomical observations, conducted by Spanish priests who considered them works of the devil. It leaves out the fact that the people who burned those manuscripts were not illiterate barbarians. They were educated men, members of the most intellectually sophisticated religious institution in Europe, who made a deliberate choice to destroy the accumulated intellectual heritage of civilization, because that heritage was incompatible with the story they needed to tell about what they were doing in Mexico and why it was right. The Bishop Juan de Zumarraga, who oversaw the systematic burning of Aztec documents in 1530, reportedly destroyed thousands of manuscripts. We will never know what was in them. We will never know what the Aztecs knew about the world, what histories they preserved, what cosmological insights they had developed over centuries of careful astronomical observation. It is gone, burned by a man who was certain he was doing God's work. This is historical rewriting at its most violent and most total. Not the selection of emphasis, not the construction of foundation myths, not the institutional bias of curriculum design. The physical elimination of the evidence. The burning of a record so that the only version of events that survives is the one written by the people who did the burning. But here is the thing that the history of historical rewriting teaches. If you are willing to learn it, it never quite works. Completely. The burning of Aztec codices did not eliminate Aztec knowledge. Some manuscripts survived, hidden, smuggled, preserved by indigenous scholars who understood what was being lost and took risks to say what they could. Indigenous oral traditions carried knowledge that the written records might have contained. The descendants of Aztec civilization did not disappear. They survived. They remembered. And in the 20th century, their descendants and the scholars who worked with them began the long process of reconstruction, piecing together what the Aztecs knew from the fragments that remained, from the oral traditions that survived the conquest, from the codices that were preserved in European libraries by collectors who valued them as curiosities, even as the church burned the rest. The Timbuktu manuscripts survived the extremists who tried to burn them. The memory of Hatshepsut survived Thutmose, the Third's campaign to erase her. The Indus Valley survived the railway builders who used its bricks as ballast. Great Zimbabwe survived the colonial officials who tried to attribute it to Phoenicians. The history of women's intellectual and economic contribution survived the legal codes that tried to make women's subordination eternal and natural. It survives because human memory is more stubborn than the institutions trying to suppress it, because there are always people who understand what is being lost and choose at personal cost to preserve it. Because the physical record, the bones, the pottery, the buildings, the DNA, cannot lie, and eventually someone comes along with the tools and the willingness to read it honestly. But the survival is never complete. Too much has been lost. Too many manuscripts burned. Too many names chiseled from too many walls. Too many languages fallen silent before anyone thought to record them. Too many traditions dismissed as superstition before anyone thought to study them. What we have is fragments, and from the fragments, we reconstruct. And the reconstruction is always incomplete. And the incompleteness matters, because what is missing from the story is not a minor detail. It is half the story, more than half. It is the story of most of humanity, living in most of the world, doing most of the work of civilization across most of human history. There is a question that has been building through this entire documentary, and it is time to face it directly. If the story of civilization we were given is so incomplete, so shaped by the perspectives of the powerful, so distorted by the needs of successive regimes and institutions, so riddled with deliberate omissions and constructed myths. Then what do we do with it? Do we throw it out? Do we declare the entire tradition of Western historical scholarship irredeemably compromised and start again from scratch? No, that would be its own kind of dishonesty. The scholarship that produced a flawed map also produced, over time, the tools for correcting the map. The discipline of history, for all its failures and biases, also developed the critical methods: source analysis, archaeological stratigraphy, comparative linguistics, genetic analysis, that are now being used to reveal its own blind spots. The tradition is not without value. It is without completeness. And the difference matters. What we do with a flawed map is what cartographers have always done with flawed maps. We correct it. We add the territories that were left out. We revise the scale of what was misrepresented. We acknowledge the perspective from which the original was drawn and compensate for its distortions. We make a better map, not a perfect one. There is no perfect map of something as vast and complex and multidirectional as the human past, but a better one, a more honest one, a map that includes the grinding women and the Timbuktu scholars and the Indus Valley engineers and the Kushite pyramid builders and the Göbekli Tepe visionaries. A map that treats the story of human civilization as what it actually is. Not the story of chosen people progressing toward a predetermined destination, but the story of all of us, stumbling and building and erasing and remembering and trying again across every continent, across every era, in every language that was ever spoken. That map is not finished. It will never be finished, but it is being drawn. And every correction, every recovered manuscript, every re-examined assumption, every voice brought back from silence makes it more accurate than it was. The question, then, is not just what we lost. It is what we carry, what has been passed down to us, through all the erasure and all the rewriting, from the civilizations that came before. What they gave us that we use without knowing they gave it to us. What they built that we stand on without feeling the ground. Because even when the names are lost, even when the records are burned, even when the story is rewritten, the things that were built do not entirely disappear. They persist in our bodies, in our language, in our institutions, in the way we think about the sacred and the political and the possible. The legacy of human civilization is not contained in the textbooks. It is woven into the fabric of everyday life, invisible and omnipresent, a gift from 10,000 years of human striving that we have largely forgotten to acknowledge. That is the next chapter, and in some ways, it is the most important one, because understanding where we come from is not an academic exercise. It is the only honest foundation for understanding who we are. This morning, before you did anything else, you probably did several things without thinking about them. You woke up and oriented yourself in time. You knew what day it was, roughly what hour it was, what season you were in. You did this automatically, effortlessly, using a system of timekeeping so deeply embedded in daily life that it feels less like a human invention and more like a feature of reality itself. You may have eaten something. Bread, perhaps, or rice, or corn, the three grains that between them feed the majority of the human species. You prepared it using tools whose fundamental design has not changed in thousands of years. You season it with spices that have been traded across oceans for longer than most nations have existed. You may have thought about money, about what you owe, what you are owed, what things cost, what your labor is worth. You did this using concepts: debt, interest, credit, the convertibility of goods into abstract value that were formalized in the temple economies of Sumer 5,000 years ago. You live in a house or apartment whose basic structural logic, walls, roof, rooms organized by function, a space for cooking, a space for sleeping, a space for gathering, has roots in the first permanent human settlements of the Neolithic period. The city or town you live in was almost certainly planned on a grid, or at least organized around a logic of grid. A design principle that engineers in the Indus Valley were applied with extraordinary precision 4,500 years ago. Everything about your ordinary morning is archaeology. Every gesture, every tool, every concept you reach for without thinking carries within it the compressed history of 10,000 years of human problem-solving, cultural transmission, and civilizational inheritance. You are not a modern person who sometimes thinks about ancient history. You are, in the most literal sense, the product of ancient history. It is inside you. It constitutes you. The question is whether you know it, and what difference knowing it makes. Let's begin with the most fundamental inheritance of all, language. The language you think in is not a neutral medium, a transparent window through which reality passes unaltered. It is a structure, a set of categories, distinctions, metaphors, and embedded assumptions about how the world works that shapes what you can easily think and what requires effort to articulate. And that structure has a history, a deep, specific, traceable history that connects the words in your mouth to the mouths of people who lived thousands of years ago. If you speak English or any European language or Persian or Hindi or most of the languages of the Iranian plateau and the Indian subcontinent, you speak a descendant of Proto-Indo-European. This was a language reconstructed by historical linguists working backward from its surviving descendants because no written record exists, spoken somewhere on the Eurasian steppe, probably in a region of what is now Ukraine and Kazakhstan, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, by people who herded cattle and horses, who had a word for wheel and axle, who worshipped sky gods and organized themselves in patrilineal clans. The spread of Proto-Indo-European and its daughter languages across Europe and large parts of Asia was one of the most consequential events in the history of human communication. It carried with it not just words, but conceptual categories. The word father in English, pater in Latin, pater in Greek, pitcher in Sanskrit, and vader in Dutch. These are all descendants of the same Proto-Indo-European root. The kinship system embedded in this word, the social and legal relationships it implied, the authority it conferred, all of this traveled with the language, shaping the societies that adopted it. When you use the word God in English, you're using a word whose Proto-Indo-European ancestor is related to the Sanskrit word Deva, the divine beings of the Vedic tradition. When you say the word fire, you are using a word related to the Sanskrit Agni, the sacred fire of Vedic ritual, which Agni, the fire god, embodied. The sacred vocabulary of a Bronze Age steppe-herding culture is alive in your everyday speech. This is not a curiosity. It is evidence of the actual mechanism of cultural transmission. Ideas travel inside language. When a language spreads, its conceptual architecture spreads with it. The assumptions embedded in its grammar, about time, about agency, about the relationship between self and world, become an invisible frame through which millions of subsequent speakers experience reality. And the languages that were displaced, the pre-Indo-European languages of Europe, the languages of the Bronze Age cultures that were absorbed or replaced, took their conceptual worlds with them into silence. Basque, the language spoken by a small community in the mountains between Spain and France, is the only surviving pre-Indo-European language of Western Europe. Linguists study it with something approaching reverence, because it is a window into a way of organizing experience that is genuinely different from anything the Indo-European tradition produced. What conceptual worlds disappeared when the other pre-Indo-European languages of Europe fell silent? What ways of understanding time, kinship, divinity, the natural world? We cannot know. The loss is real and it is permanent, and it lives in the silence inside the words we use every day without knowing what replaced them. Now, let's talk about the calendar. Because the calendar is one of the places where the hidden history of civilization is most immediately visible, if you know where to look. The 7-day week is not a natural division of time. There is no astronomical phenomenon that corresponds to 7 days. The month approximates the lunar cycle. The year approximates the solar cycle. The day is the period of the Earth's rotation. But the week, 7 days and rest and 7 again, is a human invention. And it is one of the most pervasive inventions in history, now observed in virtually every country on Earth, embedded in the legal and economic and social infrastructure of every modern society. Where did it come from? The most widely accepted answer traces the 7-day week to Mesopotamia, specifically Babylonian astronomy, with the 7 celestial bodies visible to naked eye. The Sun, the Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn were each associated with a day. The Babylonian system was adopted, in modified form, by the Romans, who gave the days the names of their own gods corresponding to the Babylonian deities. Dies Solis, Dies Luni, Dies Martis, Dies Mercurii, Dies Iovis, Dies Veneris, Dies Saturni. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. In English, the Norse gods replace several of the Roman ones. Tuesday is Tyr's Day. Wednesday is Woden's Day. Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is Frigg's Day. So the English week is a palimpsest, layer upon layer of religious tradition, Babylonian astronomy, Roman planetary theology, Norse mythology, all compressed into 7 words you use to organize every single week of your life. The Hebrew Sabbath, adopted into Christianity and then Islam in modified forms, added a theological dimension that reinforced the weekly structure across 3 of the world's largest religious traditions. The 7-day week survived the fall of Rome, the conversion of Europe to Christianity, the spread of Islam across the Middle East and North Africa and Central Asia, the colonial expansion of European culture across the Americas and Sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia, and the globalization of the modern economy. It is now, effectively, a universal human institution, and its origins lie in the astronomical observations of Babylonian priests watching the night sky for 1,000 years ago. Every time you say what day of the week it is, you're speaking a sentence composed of the names of Babylonian celestial bodies, Roman planetary gods, and Norse deities. The ancient world is alive in your Tuesday. Let's talk about mathematics, because this is where the hidden history becomes most consequential and most under-acknowledged. The number system you use, the so-called Hindu-Arabic numeral system, the one with the digits 0 through 9, and the positional notation that allows us to represent any number with just those 10 symbols, was developed in India, refined and transmitted by Islamic scholars, and arrived in Europe through the intellectual exchange of the medieval Islamic world with European scholarship. The foundational concept, 0 as a number, not just as a placeholder, but as a genuine mathematical quantity, was developed by Indian mathematicians, with the Brahmasusadhana of Brahmagupta in 628 CE representing one of the earliest formal treatments of 0 as a number with its own mathematical properties. The concept was carried westward by Islamic scholars, particularly Al-Khwarizmi, whose 9th century treatise on calculation gave us the word algebra and whose name, Latinized as algorithmus, gave us the word algorithm, and introduced the European mathematics through translations made in 12th century Spain, where Islamic, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked side by side in one of the most remarkable intellectual environments in medieval history. Without 0, there is no calculus. Without calculus, there is no classical mechanics. Without classical mechanics, there is no engineering, no physics, no technology as we understand it. The digital device on which you may be watching this documentary operates on binary arithmetic, a system of ones and zeros, which is itself a descendant of the positional notation system developed in India and transmitted through the Islamic world to Europe. The entire technological infrastructure of the modern world rests on a mathematical foundation built by Indian and Islamic scholars, whose contribution is occasionally mentioned in the history of mathematics, but has never fully penetrated the popular understanding of where science and technology come from. The common assumption is that modern science emerged from the European scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, from Copernicus and Galileo and Newton, and that everything before that was essentially background, prologue, pre-science. This is wrong. The European scientific revolution was a revolution within a tradition that had already been advanced to an extraordinary degree by Islamic science. The works of Ibn al-Haytham on optics, the astronomical tables of al-Battani, the medical encyclopedias of Ibn Sina, Avicenna, which were still being used in European medical schools in the 17th century, 500 years after they were written, the algebraic methods of Al-Khwarizmi, the geographic observations of Al-Idrisi, whose world map of 1154 was more accurate than any European map produced in the next 300 years. These were not primitive precursors to real science. They were real science, conducted with rigor, transmitted through institutions, built upon and advanced by subsequent generations of scholars working within a tradition that valued empirical observation and mathematical reasoning as the tools of understanding the natural world. When Copernicus proposed the heliocentric model of the solar system, he was working with astronomical data compiled largely by Islamic astronomers. When Galileo conducted his experiments on motion and acceleration, He was working within a tradition of empirical investigation whose methods have been developed and refined by Islamic natural philosophers. When Newton synthesized classical mechanics, he was standing on shoulders that included not just the European scientists he himself acknowledged, but the Islamic and Indian mathematical traditions that had built the tools he was using. The story of science is not a European story. It is a human story, and the selective attribution of its achievements to one tradition, while treating the contributions of others as mere transmission or preparation, is one of the most consequential forms of historical rewriting we have examined in this entire documentary. Now, let's get closer to the body, to the things we carry not in our culture, but in our biology. Modern genetics has made it possible to read the history of human migration and interaction in the DNA of living people with precision that would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago. And what that reading reveals is a picture of human history that is fundamentally different from the story of separate peoples and separate civilizations developing in isolation that the standard map implied. We are all mixed. Every living human being is a product of a history of migration, intermarriage, conquest, trade, and cultural exchange that has been happening continuously for hundreds of thousands of years. There is no pure population anywhere on Earth. There never was. The concept of racial purity, the idea that any human group has existed in biological isolation long enough to be meaningfully distinct from all others, is not just morally wrong. It is factually wrong. The genetics do not support it. What the genetics show instead is a species in constant motion. The ancestors of every living European passed through Africa, out of Africa, through the Middle East, into Central Asia, and then into Europe in multiple waves of migration over tens of thousands of years, mixing with populations already present at each stage. The ancestors of every living South Asian carried genetic signatures from the Indus Valley civilization, from Central Asian steppe migrants, and from populations that have lived in South Asia since before recorded history. The ancestors of every living East Asian, every living American, every living Australian Aboriginal person carry within their DNA the record of journeys across ice and ocean and steppe that cover nearly the entire habitable surface of the Earth. We are one species. We have always been one species. The genetic distance between any two living human beings, even those in the most geographically distant populations on Earth, is smaller than the genetic distance between two populations of chimpanzees living in adjacent forests in Central Africa. We are, genetically speaking, remarkably similar to each other. What looks like enormous diversity from the outside, the diversity of languages, of cultures, of physical appearances, is, from the perspective of our DNA, almost superficial. Variations on a single, very recent, very closely related theme. This matters because it means that when we talk about the inheritance of civilization, about what we carry from the ancient past, we are not talking about something that belongs to one group and not others. We are talking about a shared inheritance, a common legacy, the accumulated achievement of a single species, building and failing, and rebuilding across 10,000 years on every habitable continent. The woman who ground grain in ancient Susa is an ancestor, in one sense or another, of everyone alive today. The Sumerian scribes who invented writing, the Indus Valley engineers who designed urban drainage, the Kushite astronomers who watched the stars from the Nile Valley, the Islamic mathematicians who gave us algebra, the West African scholars who filled the libraries of Timbuktu. They are all our ancestors, not necessarily in the biological sense, though many of them are, in the civilizational sense. In the sense that what they built and thought and discovered and transmitted became the foundation on which every subsequent generation, including ours, has stood. Let's talk about cities. Because most people reading this live in one or near one, and the city is perhaps the most direct inheritance we have from the ancient world. The problems that ancient urban planners grapple with are precisely the problems that urban planners grapple with today. How do you supply clean water to a large concentrated population? How do you remove wastewater without contaminating the water supply? How do you organize streets so that people and goods can move efficiently? How do you balance the density that makes cities economically productive with the space that makes them humanly livable? How do you ensure that the poorest residents have access to the basic infrastructure, water, waste management, public space, that the richest residents take for granted? The engineers of Mohenjo-Daro solved the water and waste problem with a sophistication that the cities of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt did not match. The grid planners of Miletus and Alexandria set templates for urban design that influenced Roman city planning, which influenced the design of medieval European cities, which influenced the layout of colonial cities in the Americas, which influenced the grid streets of cities from New York to Buenos Aires to Melbourne. The zoning logic that separates residential from commercial from industrial space in modern cities has roots in a functional specialization of districts that is visible in the archaeological record of Bronze Age urban centers. The agora of the Greek city-state, the public square where citizens gathered, debated, traded, and conducted the business of civic life, was not a Greek invention. It was a Greek refinement of a form of public space that had existed in urban settlements for thousands of years. The market square, the temple precinct, the space where the private and the public met, where strangers became, temporarily, a community. This form persists. It is the plaza of the Spanish-speaking world, the piazza of Italy, the town square of New England, the park of the modern city. The human need for a gathering place, a space that belongs to everyone and therefore to no one, has been built into the architecture of human settlement since the first settlements. The skyscraper is new. The grid street is old. The elevator is new. The public well is old. The shopping mall is new. The market is as old as civilization. At every layer, the new sits on top of the old, using the same functional logic in a new material form. Cities are the most continuous human institution. They change constantly, and they never stop being what they've always been. The place where people go to exchange what they have for what they need, to live among strangers, and to build something larger than any individual could build alone. Now, let's talk about religion. Not theology, not about which beliefs are true or false. About the historical transmission of religious ideas and practices, which is one of the most powerful and least acknowledged forms of cultural inheritance. The great world religions that currently shape the beliefs and practices of the majority of humanity, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, did not emerge from nothing. They emerged from older traditions that they absorbed, modified, and in some cases deliberately displaced. And tracing the lines of inheritance reveals a pattern of civilizational continuity that crosses the boundaries of the separate religious traditions themselves. The concept of the soul, a non-material essence that constitutes the individual, survives death and is subject to divine judgment, is so deeply embedded in the major world religions that it feels like a universal human intuition. But it has a history. Its most influential early formulation in the Western tradition came from ancient Greece, particularly from Plato, who developed a philosophical account of the soul as immortal, non-material, and fundamentally distinct from the body. Plato's account was itself influenced by earlier Greek traditions, which were in turn influenced by Egyptian religious ideas about the Ba and the Ka, the aspects of the person that survived death, that had been developing for thousands of years in the Nile Valley. When early Christian theologians grappled with the question of what happened to a person after death, they worked with conceptual tools borrowed from Platonic philosophy. The Christian theology of the soul, as it was formalized by Augustine and later by Thomas Aquinas, is a synthesis of Hebrew biblical tradition with Platonic philosophical categories. It carries within it, compressed and transformed, thousands of years of prior religious and philosophical thinking about what a person is and what persists after the body dies. Islamic theology engaged with the same Greek philosophical tradition, the same questions about the soul and the nature of God and the relationship between divine knowledge and human free will. Buddhist philosophy, developing in a different tradition entirely, arrive at a radically different answer to the same question. The self is not a persistent soul, but a temporary constellation of processes, and the goal of spiritual practice is the dissolution of the illusion of selfhood rather than its eternal preservation. These are not parallel conversations happening in isolation. They are branches of a single long argument about the nature of consciousness and the meaning of existence, conducted across thousands of years in dozens of cultures, each branch drawing on and responding to the others in ways that are often not acknowledged. The prayer practices of Christianity, the postures, the timing, the concept of dedicated daily intervals for communication with the divine, have parallels and possible influences from the daily prayer practices of ancient Egyptian temple religion and Zoroastrian fire worship. The fasting practices of Ramadan in Islam have structural similarities to fasting practices in Judaism and Christianity and Hinduism that all trace, through different routes, to ancient Near Eastern religious traditions in which the withdrawal from food was a technology for altering consciousness and approaching the sacred. The pilgrimage, the journey to a sacred place as a spiritual act, appears in virtually every religious tradition on earth. Mecca, Jerusalem, the Ganges, Varanasi, Lourdes, Bodh Gaya, Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Göbekli Tepe was almost certainly a pilgrimage site, a place people traveled to from a wide surrounding region for reasons that were spiritual rather than economic. The impulse to make a sacred journey is at least 12,000 years old. It may be older. It is so consistent across cultures, so geographically and temporally distant from each other, that it begins to look less like a cultural practice and more like a human need. We are a species that makes pilgrimages, that needs to travel towards something larger than ourselves and mark the arrival. The modern stadium concert, the sports championship, the political rally. These are secular pilgrimages. They serve the same function. The gathering of a community around a shared focus of meaning. The suspension of ordinary time in favor of sacred time. The return home transformed, or at least temporarily renewed. We are not as different from our ancient ancestors as we like to think, not in our deepest needs. Let's get very specific. Let's talk about bread. Bread is the oldest prepared food in the world for which we have continuous evidence. A flatbread made from wild grains and water was found at a site in northern Jordan called Shabaka 1, dating to approximately 14,400 years ago, 3,000 years before the invention of agriculture. Somebody gathered wild grain, ground it, mixed it with water, and cooked it on a hot stone. Before farming, before cities, before anything we conventionally call civilization. Bread, the leavened bread that most people in the world eat today. Bread made with yeast, which causes the dough to rise and creates the characteristic texture of a loaf, appears to have been discovered in ancient Egypt, probably accidentally, when wild yeast in the air inoculated a batch of grain paste left out overnight. The Egyptians became the great bread makers of the ancient world. They had dozens of varieties. Their bakers were skilled professionals. The grain and bread trade was one of the pillars of the Egyptian economy. The Greeks learned bread making from the Egyptians and refined it further. The Romans industrialized it. Roman cities had commercial bakeries, and the government distributed bread to the urban poor through a system called the annona. Medieval European monasteries preserved and developed baking traditions through periods when urban civilization had contracted. And from the medieval European tradition descended the bread traditions of the modern Western world, the baguette, the sourdough, the rye loaf. But bread also developed independently in other parts of the world from different grain bases, producing different forms. Flatbreads made from wheat and barley in the Middle East and South Asia. Rice-based breads in East and Southeast Asia. Corn tortillas in Mesoamerica. Injera, the spongy flatbread made from teff, in Ethiopia. Each of these is a separate tradition of human problem solving. How do you make raw grain digestible, portable, storable, and nourishing? Arriving at different solutions with the same tools. Heat, grain, and water. The food on your plate is a civilizational document. Every staple grain, every cooking technique, every spice in your cabinet has a history that connects it to ancient trade networks, agricultural innovations, and the daily labor of people who solved problems of nutrition and flavor without knowing they were making history. The pepper in your spice rack was one of the primary motivations for the European age of exploration. The Portuguese and Spanish and later the Dutch and English built global empires, in significant part, to control the trade in spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, that grew only in specific parts of South and Southeast Asia and were worth more than gold in the markets of medieval Europe. The spice trade connected the kitchens of Europe to the forests of the Maluku Islands in what is now Indonesia, to the gardens of Sri Lanka, to the coastal cities of Malabar and India. It created the economic conditions for colonialism, and it put pepper in your spice cabinet. Let's talk about one more thing. Something that may seem abstract, but is in fact the most immediate and practical inheritance we have from ancient civilization, the concept of rights. The idea that individual human beings possess certain entitlements by virtue of their humanity, entitlements that limit what governments and other powerful institutions can do to them, is generally traced, in the Western tradition, to the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, to Locke and Rousseau and Jefferson, to the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, to a moment in modern European history when a new philosophical and political tradition crystallized around the dignity of the individual. But look earlier. Look at the Code of Hammurabi, carved in Babylonian cuneiform around 1750 BC, one of the oldest surviving legal codes in the world. Its famous prologue declares that Hammurabi was appointed by the gods to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil doers, so that the strong should not harm the weak, so that widows and orphans should be protected. The specific provisions of the code are a mixture of protections and oppressions that reflect the hierarchies of ancient Mesopotamian society. But the animating principle, that power should be constrained by law, that the strong should not be free to harm the weak without consequence, is recognizably the ancestor of what we mean by rights. Look at the Cyrus cylinder, produced in 539 BCE by the Persian king Cyrus the Great after his conquest of Babylon. Cyrus issued a declaration allowing the peoples conquered by the Babylonian Empire to return to their homelands and practice their own religions freely. This has been called by some scholars the world's first human rights charter, an overstatement perhaps, but not without basis. The principle of religious tolerance, of a ruler's obligation to respect the practices of subject peoples, is articulated clearly in that cylinder. Look at Ashoka, the Indian emperor who ruled most of the subcontinent in the 3rd century BCE and who, after witnessing the devastation caused by his own military campaigns, converted to Buddhism and issued a series of edicts, carved on rocks and pillars across his empire, proclaiming the principles of nonviolence, religious tolerance, and the moral obligation of rulers to the welfare of their subjects. Ashoka's edicts are among the most extraordinary political documents in the ancient world, not for their rhetorical grandeur, but for their moral specificity. He says what rulers should not do. He acknowledges that his own government has caused suffering. He commits to doing less harm. The lineage of the idea of rights runs through all of these documents and many more, through the Magna Carta, through the Spanish legal debates about the rights of indigenous Americans, through the writings of Islamic jurists who developed sophisticated theories of legal protection for non-Muslim subjects of Muslim rulers, through the abolitionist movements that applied Enlightenment principles to the situation of enslaved people with a logical consistency that the original Enlightenment thinkers had failed to muster. It is not a single tradition with a single origin. It is a conversation conducted across cultures and centuries, arriving at the current moment with a content that is genuinely new: universal suffrage, international human rights law, the Convention Against Torture, but with roots that go deep into the moral imagination of civilizations we barely remember. When you assert a right to speak, to believe, to assemble, to be treated according to due process, to live without arbitrary violence, you are reaching into a tradition 10,000 years deep. You are the beneficiary of arguments made by Babylonian jurists and Indian emperors and Islamic legal scholars and European philosophers and African freedom fighters, all of whom, in their different ways and their different languages, were working on the same problem, the problem of what human beings owe each other, what the powerful owe the weak, what a civilization owes the people who build it. We have traveled a long way in this documentary. From a hilltop in Turkey 12,000 years ago, where unnamed people built something magnificent before the world was ready to understand why, through the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where writing was invented to track beer rations and ended up recording the first literature, through the ghost cities of the Indus Valley, their drains and their baths and their unread script, through the libraries of Timbuktu and the pyramids of Sudan, and the burning of manuscripts by men who feared what was written in them, through the grinding women and the high priestesses and the queens whose names were chiseled from the walls, through the catastrophe of the Bronze Age collapse, when a globalized world fell silent in a generation, through the machinery of historical rewriting, the foundation myths and the invented traditions and the curriculum decisions and the book burnings, through which every civilization has tried to make itself the necessary culmination of everything that came before. And now here, in the present, in the ordinary Tuesday of your life, where the calendar on your wall carries the names of Babylonian planets, where the number system in your pocket is a gift from Indian and Islamic mathematicians, where the bread on your table is a 14,000-year-old technology, where the city you live in applies planning principles first worked out in the Indus Valley, where the idea that you have rights, that you cannot be treated as merely a means to someone else's end, is a distilled product of a moral argument that every civilization has been trying to get right since the first laws were carved in stone. You are not separate from all of this. You are the current expression of it. And that changes the question. The question is not, what did they build, and how much of it do we remember? The question is, now that we know what they built, and how much of it we misremember, what do we do? There is a word in the Zulu language that has no direct equivalent in English, Ubuntu. It is usually translated approximately as I am because we are, the idea that a person is not an isolated individual whose identity exists prior to and independent of their relationships. That selfhood is not something you have alone. It is something that happens between people, in the space of recognition, of mutual acknowledgement, of shared history and shared future. I am because we are. This is not a primitive intuition. It is not a charming philosophical curiosity from a culture, the standard map placed at the margins. It is one of the most sophisticated understandings of human identity ever articulated. And it is, when you look honestly at what this documentary has uncovered, the most accurate description of what civilization actually is. We have been taught to think of civilization as an achievement, a thing that certain people built and others received, a gift flowing in one direction from one point of origin, a line moving forward through time toward greater complexity, greater sophistication, greater power. But that is not what civilization is. That has never been what civilization is. Civilization is a conversation, the longest conversation in human history, conducted across every continent, in every language, by every kind of person. A conversation about how to live together, how to feed each other, how to manage the fact that human beings are simultaneously deeply social and deeply individual, capable of extraordinary cooperation and extraordinary cruelty, able to build cities that house millions and burn them in a season. That conversation has no single author. It has no single beginning. And it has no destination that has already been determined. It is still going. We are in it right now. Let's take stock of what we actually know after everything we have examined. We know that the capacity for complex organized behavior, monument building, symbolic thought, long-range social coordination is at least 12,000 years old, and probably much older. Göbekli Tepe was not the first extraordinary thing human beings built. It is simply the oldest one we have found so far. We know that the story of civilization cannot be told from a single point of origin. Cities arose independently in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley in Egypt and China and the Americas. Writing was invented independently in multiple places. Agriculture was invented independently on multiple continents, in multiple forms, by multiple peoples. The human impulse to organize, to build, to record, to transmit, this impulse does not belong to any one culture. It belongs to the species. We know that civilizations that achieved extraordinary things were erased from the standard map, sometimes by accident, sometimes by the structural biases of the disciplines that were supposed to recover them, and sometimes deliberately by people who needed those civilizations to be invisible for reasons that had everything to do with power and economics and the psychology of domination. We know that the erasure was never complete. The bones survive. The DNA survives. The manuscripts survive when people risk their lives to save them. The memory survives, transmitted through oral tradition and material culture and the bodies of the people who carry it forward without knowing that is what they're doing. We know that what we call the Western tradition, the intellectual and cultural heritage most modern institutions present as the foundation of civilization, is itself a synthesis, a borrowing and blending from sources across the entire ancient world. Greek philosophy and Islamic mathematics and Indian numerals and Egyptian theology and Mesopotamian law and Phoenician alphabets and countless other contributions that have been attributed over centuries of selective telling to a narrower and narrower stream of originators. We know that women built the foundations of civilization in agriculture, in textile production, in religious authority, in economic management. And were then, as civilization became more politically organized and militarily focused, written out of the record of what they had built. We know that the story of collapse is as important as the story of building. That the Bronze Age world, more globalized, more sophisticated, more institutionally complex than most people imagine, ended in a catastrophe that was a product not of external attack alone, but of internal fragility, of a system optimized for efficiency at the cost of resilience, of elite over-extraction from a population that had no slack left to absorb a crisis when the crisis came. And we know that from every collapse, something grew, not automatically, not without enormous suffering and loss, but inevitably, because the human impulse to build does not require ideal conditions. It only requires humans. So what does all of this mean? Not just intellectually, not just as a corrective to the textbooks, but personally, practically. What does it mean to know this, to carry this, to live in the aftermath of this long and complicated and beautiful and terrible human story? I think it means several things. The first is humility, real humility, not the performed humility of a civilization that calls itself humble while continuing to assume its own centrality, but the structural humility of understanding that whatever we have built, whatever any of us has built, in whatever tradition we were born into, is a small chapter in a much longer story, that the people who came before us were not primitive. They were not waiting for us to arrive and show them what civilization looked like. They were doing extraordinary things in the full complexity of their own time, with the full capacity of the same species we belong to, and they deserve to be understood on their own terms. The second is honesty, about what the record we inherited actually is, what it includes and what it excludes, whose voices are in it and whose are not. This is not about guilt, about sitting with the weight of historical wrongs and allowing that weight to become an excuse for paralysis. It is about accuracy, about the simple insistence that a map of the human past that excludes most of human experience is not a good map, and that building on a bad map produces bad outcomes. Every field that touches on human history, archaeology, anthropology, history, genetics, linguistics, philosophy, is currently in a process of revision, of expanding the map, of recovering voices and civilizations and contributions that the standard account left out. This is not a political project masquerading as scholarship. It is scholarship doing what scholarship is supposed to do, following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. The discomfort is not a signal that something has gone wrong. It is a signal that something's gone right. The third thing this story means, I think, is connection, not the sentimental version of connection. The idea that we are all one and therefore nothing is difficult. The actual material, specific version. The connection that comes from understanding that the bread on your table has a 14,000-year history, that the number system in your phone is a gift from scholars who lived and died in Baghdad and Corinth and Nalanda, that the city you move through every day is applying planning principles first worked out by engineers in a civilization whose name most people cannot pronounce, that the concept of rights you invoke when you are treated unjustly as ancestors in Babylonian cuneiform and Indian rock edicts and Islamic jurisprudence and African liberation movements. You are not alone in this. You are never alone in this. You are the current expression of 10,000 years of human striving, human failure, human recovery, human insistence on building something that will outlast the individual life. That is not a small thing. That is the largest thing there is. There is a detail I have been saving for this moment. A small thing, physically, but significant in what it says. In 1999, a team of archaeologists excavating a site in South Africa called Blombo's Cave found something in a layer of sediment dating to approximately 73,000 years ago. It was a small piece of red ochre, a pigment stone about 3 centimeters long. On its surface, someone had engraved a pattern, a series of cross lines, forming a geometric design. This was not accidental. It was not the random scratching of an idle hand. The design was deliberate, intentional, made by someone who looked at a blank surface and decided to put a mark on it, to make something where there had been nothing, to impose a pattern on the world. This is the oldest known example of abstract art in the world. It is 73,000 years old. The person who made it was fully human, biologically identical to us, with the same brain, the same hands, the same capacity for thought and intention, and the desire to make a mark that would outlast the moment of its making. We do not know who they were. We do not know what the pattern meant to them. We do not know if they showed it to anyone, or they kept it private, or if they understood themselves to be doing something significant. We know nothing about them except this. They existed, they thought, and they made something. That is civilization, not the pyramid, not the city, not the legal code, or the written epic, or the university library. Those are all expressions of it, magnificent and important. But the thing itself, the irreducible core of what civilization is this: a human being, looking at a blank surface, and deciding to make a mark, to say, I was here, I thought, I made something, it meant something to me, perhaps it will mean something to you. Every book ever written, every building ever built, every law ever codified, every prayer ever spoken, every song ever sung is an elaboration of that gesture. The 73,000-year-old engraving on a piece of red ochre is the ancestor of Gilgamesh and the Vedas and the Timbuktu manuscripts, and the Code of Hammurabi and the Pythagorean theorem and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and this documentary. It is the beginning of the conversation, and the conversation has not ended. The lie that was told about the origins of civilization, the comfortable, narrowing, flattering lie, was not just an error in the textbooks. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to believe that the human story was rich enough, wide enough, old enough, complex enough to be worth telling in full. It was, in the end, a failure of nerve. The nerve it takes to look at a story as large and as messy and as contradictory as the actual history of our species and say, yes, all of this, all of it counts. The Sumerian beer ration and the Indus drain, and the Timbuktu manuscript, and the Kushite pyramid, and the grinding woman's fractured bones, and the high priestess's poem, and the Bronze Age letter that was never sent. All of it is a story. There is no center. There is no hierarchy. There is no chosen people and no chosen tradition. There is only this long, improbable, still unfinished attempt by one species to figure out how to live together on a shared world. The real origins of civilization are not a single sunrise. They are the accumulated light of 10,000 dawns on every continent, in every language, by every kind of human being who ever woke up and decided to build something rather than nothing. That is the truth. The standard map was not large enough to hold. We need a larger map. We have always needed a larger map. And now, finally, slowly, painfully, incompletely, we are drawing one. The first civilization was not built by a particular people in a particular river valley on a particular date. It was built by us. All of us. It is still being built. And what we build next depends entirely on whether we have the honesty to understand what was built before.